Ladies and gentlemen, it is November the 7th, 2021. It's a lovely day. Stormy, windy, raining. A perfect day to discuss the world with Mr. Agent Smith. Where is he? There he is. Hello?
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 Hey,
Hello?
can you hear me?
Yep. I just like saying hello a couple times, just to be sure.
Verification. Gotcha.
Yeah, man. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing okay. How are you?
Much better than yesterday.
What happened yesterday?
We tried something with our guild that ended up making it really powerful for one group and weak for the other one because we're trying to run two raids, you know?
Mhm.
And there was a discussion debate that we had in the previous phase about, do we want an A team, B team format where the A team is just straight up, you pick the best performers with the best team composition and you just send them in and they're going to get killer good results. And then the B team is everyone who's left over and they just try to get some bosses down. Or do you try to more or less balance the team so they're about equal power level and they can see equal number of bosses? And we decided that we were going to do the second one. But for this last week, we were really close to getting a boss kill. And we ended up super stacking one of the groups. They did get the boss kill, which is fantastic. Clap, clap. But the other raid was really tilting and frustrating. So that kind of causes us to kind of reevaluate. What is our vision? What is our mission? Do we want to keep doing this or tune it back a little bit? And we're going to shuffle things up. I've got plans. We had a nice meeting. The officers are all on the same page and stuff, so I would say it's more of a short-term speed bump as a result of us experimenting and stuff, but long-term we're in a pretty strong position, so I have lots of cause to be hopeful and optimistic. But it is a new challenge. Last time it was everyone's in a single 40-person raid, so that's one speed of clearing one power level total, and we just decide who gets a spot and who doesn't, whereas now we have two separate runs, 25 people each. How do you organize those? Pretty complex question.
Sounds like it. I don't begrudge you the responsibility.
Leadership is it's not as sexy as I thought it was going to be. One leadership thing that I was doing was I put myself in the run that has people who are not in the guild and whatnot to try to make it as smooth and good as possible, when I could have just as easily put myself in the zoomy fast run that's all guild. And my character and my ability and stuff would thrive in that environment, but at the same time I wouldn't really be able to like articulate what our guild culture is as the guild leader for new people and just try to show them a good run, because that would be their first impression, right? We have 3 open spots for a week, and you get people in the run. You don't really want to invite them to a disaster run. You would like to show them a nice smooth run so you show that your guild can operate smoothly and well. But it was kind of hard to not be present for that. The first time our guild got one of the toughest bosses, like I just straight up wasn't in that raid, I was in the other one. And that felt kind of bad, honestly. Bittersweet kind of moment. We also put a whole bunch of our really good healers in the other raid, so they had the best possible chance to get the boss down, but it was fully at the cost of our experience in the other raid.
Sure.
Yeah.
Difficult trade-offs, huh?
Yeah. But good learning experiences. And we have a lot of really good players. Overall, the guild is in a strong spot. It was just a good time to evaluate what we were doing.
Have you considered a Thunderdome style system of admitting new entrants?
What is that?
Just have them fight with each other, and whoever wins is the new applicant.
Oh, yeah, yeah. That sounds entertaining. Kind of stressful.
It'll certainly weed out the weak from the strong anyway.
True. Our guild, though, we're more of a mom and dad guild where we don't expect people to be like super uber tryhard gamers who are like striving to play perfectly. As long as you play decently and you're nice to people, you're good.
That's probably the healthier way to do it.
It is. One of the challenges, though, is you have some people in the raid who can be super uber gamer, and they are choosing to be with a guild that's a little bit more casual, that has a little bit easier requirements and stuff, which sometimes they'll look at the people who are, say, a mom or dad who doesn't have all their gear min-max, and they're like, what the fuck are you doing? And then they'll put pressure on them and make them feel like they're not good enough and they're not doing enough and that kind of thing. So we have to be constantly vigilant of that mindset so we don't fall into it. It is seductive. People get a little number at the end of raids. It's called your parse, and it tells you what percentile you were in for people of that role and class and stuff. So if you do really well, maybe it says, hey, you were in the 99th percentile of all people of your class and spec. That feels really good. That's kind of like getting a 99 on a test or whatever. But oftentimes that means you have to play selfishly in a way that maybe wasn't the best for the team overall, but it was good for you. So that's a tricky thing to balance too, is being a team player versus saying, well, this is my week to shine and look amazing.
Well, managing egos is a big part of managing any large group.
Mm-hmm.
Have you considered setting up an internal security apparatus to police your members?
What would that involve?
Well, you can just make sure they're not talking shit to each other and just make sure that they're playing in the appropriate way, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, if the Stasi can do it, why can't you?
Yeah, there's a tricky thing too of like, where's the line of this is playful banter versus this is now toxic? Because you do have, say within friend groups where you've known each other for a long time and you talk a little bit of shit to each other and it's all in good fun and everyone's kind of laughing and they know that feelings aren't getting hurt. But occasionally you'll have people who are consistently bantering and it's really upsetting people and they won't stop. And it kind of it grates over time. So that would be
an opportunity for a commissar to step in and put them in their place.
Yeah. We were discussing it a little bit in the officer meeting about the difference between a raid leader and a raider and chain of command, which is, it has full application in military. You have to know, like, if 3 people say a strategy, you're going to go with the person in the highest in the chain of command for which strategy you're going to go with. And it has some upsides and downsides, right? Because sometimes the leader is wrong and everyone follows them to the mistake. Sometimes the leader is right and you follow them to victory. If you don't always follow them, then the whole team ends up being kind of like a herd of cats, as opposed to disciplined soldiers where they're all kind of like, well, actually like the other plan better, so I'm going to do that. And this other guy said this, and I would prefer to do that. So you just end up being really disjointed and dysfunctional. So we wanted to revisit that a little bit of what is the communication priority. If people are talking, like, who are we listening to as the final word? It's a super common thing, especially when things go awry a little bit. Say the team goes up to a boss, they have a strat that's planned, they say what it is, and then they fail. A lot of people will just get their idea hats out and they'll be like, well, I heard of this other team who did it this way. And then it becomes like a brainstorming session instead of a, okay, well, freshen up, rebuff, and then we'll try it again. And we're going to just trust that the plan is good and follow what our leader is saying. Even though I know that it could be done a different way, I'm going to respect the chain of command just for the purpose of teamwork and team unity. which is super valuable. I'm thinking of the the hockey movie, The Miracle or whatever, where it was the U.S. versus, was it Soviet Union still at that point, or Russia?
Soviet Union. It would have been 1981, I want to say.
Yeah, and in this match, the Soviet Union, you could say their team had way more raw talent and skill than the American team. They're just a bunch of superstar hockey players who are amazing. But the difference was the American team, they knew that they were worse, so they really had to rely on each other and trust each other and work as a team. And that was kind of the theme of the movie, is worse players beating better players because they work together better.
They actually didn't have any superstars on the American team.
There was a reason for that, right?
Yeah, this is back. Technically, Olympians are not supposed to be professionals. And so for a long time, professional NHL players, as well as, I think, players from other professional leagues, I'm not as familiar with them, but professional NHL players could not play in the Olympics because they were considered professionals. And so the U.S. Olympic teams, through most of the history of the Olympics, were generally college players, up to and including the 1981 team at the Lake Placid Olympics. Those were all really good but very young college hockey players playing against the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about the Soviet Union is that they did not consider their professional hockey players to be professionals. They argued that all of their hockey players were volunteers, since they weren't really being paid like professionals. You know, it's a flat communist society. So they argued that they were all just enthusiasts. So,
look, these guys aren't hockey pros. They just really like the game.
Yeah.
And they happen to be better than everyone else's hockey players.
Yeah. So their teams were obviously way better than anybody else's teams for a long time. You know, the Soviet hockey team won a lot of gold medals once the Cold War started. You know, after World War II, up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet hockey team was pretty much a beast, almost impossible to beat. And that was the real miracle of the 1981 Winter Olympics. That was college players beating a professional Soviet hockey team. But your point is well taken.
Yep. Team unity goes a super long way towards success.
Yeah.
We've had a similar thing as well, where the team that we stacked with more, say, raw performance value, they fought with each other more and ended up being dysfunctional in certain ways because they're more particular about, it needs to be this way for me to do my thing well. Whereas I was in the more casual run, we have like pugs and people who aren't guilded and stuff in it. And we don't give a fuck. It's fine. Who cares? You don't have this buff, you don't have that buff, nobody cares. We're here to have a good time. And a good time we shall have.
The more casual approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're not paying our players, so even if they're very good, they can still be counted as enthusiasts.
Are there guilds in WoW that pay players to join them?
I think for like the modern retail WoW version, if you're chat, maybe you know better than I do. If you're in a mythic clearing guild that does like world first and stuff, you're kind of a pro gamer where they pay you, right? I think you're like sponsored and on a team, kind of like how I'm on a StarCraft team. There are some big WoW teams that whenever there's a new raid boss added, they all race each other to try to get the world first boss kill.
Interesting. So they make their money from advertising?
Yes. The teams can be sponsored by like usually Razer, Corsair, like gaming peripheral kind of companies and stuff.
Are there competitions in WoW?
Yes, there are arena tournaments and like those PvE tournaments. I think there's a mythic raiding tournament where formerly at BlizzCon, they're not having it this year, but they would all try to do the raid in a certain amount of time. So they're kind of racing each other in a speed running fashion.
Oh. So it's the ones that do well in the competitions that get the sponsorships.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So they don't just sponsor them because they're good at Warcraft.
Correct. You would have to do something exceptionally good.
And it's interesting how little markets like that can pop up. All of it propped up by advertising money.
The viewership and interest in esports is pretty high.
Yeah.
And the WoW player base is enormous, so. We're pretty far from that. We have some talented players, but we're not one of those kind of guilds.
Yeah, advertising money is kind of the secret sauce to a lot of the internet. It's kind of the financial backbone for a lot of, well, services, but also just experiences, you know, stuff like free-to-play games and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be interesting to see what happens if there were less liquidity in financial markets. Because a lot of tech firms that power advertising spending, a lot of them kind of depend on cheap money. So if anything happens in terms of higher interest rates and whatnot, that could be a problem. We'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Not there yet. I don't think the Fed is really going to jerk up interest rates too much in the near term. I think they're pretty paranoid about it. We don't really know what that's going to do. We're going to find out the hard way, most likely. Was there anything you wanted to kind of get on?
I watched a documentary on QAnon. It was kind of funny.
What was that like?
One of the things, it's basically conspiracy theory. You could think of it like a really saucy juice that people can get more or less addicted to. And it tells you specifically that you understand something behind the curtain that other people just really don't. And that can be a very exciting feeling. And a lot of people, they're not really fitting into whatever group that they're in, and it gives them that kind of sense of belonging that you can get from just different community involvement. Sometimes people will cite this for people getting involved in gang-related activities as they just didn't ever find their niche, and this is a community that will accept them if they, in this case, they have to swear some oath. It's a pretty simple one. They just have a tagline or whatever, which some politicians have actually said during speeches and stuff. So you've got some people in the legit political sphere who are making nods to this group, and they're all about like finding codes, either number codes or signals, and these like random posts and places on the internet that are supposedly this QAnon person, and then creating some narrative and web about what's happening all behind the scenes of the deep state and that kind of stuff. So it's basically kind of like, I don't know, a process of conspiracy theories getting more and more dank over time to the point now where that's a super intense one that a lot of people are really into, and they can basically browse QAnon related stuff all day if they want to. There's just so much raw content out there.
Wow.
Fuzzy Cord saying it's an alternate reality live action role playing. Kind of, but they don't think that they're role playing. They think that it's real.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah, the conspiracy theory community has really been supercharged by the internet over the past couple decades, and it's been a real weird experience watching how they've evolved over time. Because, you know, I'm old enough to remember when it was just kind of a neat little niche group, right? Because you remember X-Files, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So that had its own little subculture that was tied into it, and it was fun. It wasn't like a big deal. But since then, it's taken a weird turn. I don't really know entirely how to frame it because it's not like a cult per se, but it has characteristics therein. It's
Yeah,
kind of like this.
there's a group membership which is cult-like, and then it has a lot of outsider elements where it's just written off as absurd and bullshit by a lot of standard society. So they'll feel like by choosing to join QAnon, they're also choosing to be an outcast of regular society, which is similar to joining a cult. One thing that I was kind of meditating on while I was listening to some of these really weird claims that they're making would be how they connect with just some of the general dissatisfaction and malcontent with politics and government. If people are saying, I really don't like the politicians who are in power right now, I don't like how they do things, and I think they're corrupt. That's a legit feeling that people can have. But it's not really pinned down to any thing in particular. It's kind of a vague assessment of, I don't really like the leadership, I don't think that they're serving my best interests. And then whenever someone makes like a really crazy claim of like, well, the politicians are actually doing these kind of crazy rituals secretly behind the scenes and it's majorly fucked up, they want to believe in those things because it more or less confirms, yeah, these are bad people in the government or whatever, and they're really bad people and we need to figure all this out and save the world. So it kind of goes from not really having a great answer for, yeah, our government has some flaws and some failings and we could definitely do some stuff better, and there are politicians who take some pretty corrupt dealings from people, but the system is better than a lot of other systems, and we do have some people in politics who are, I think, doing their diligence and trying their best. But yeah, it's a very dank narrative that they've woven with the QAnon in the sense of the intensity of the claims.
Yeah, it's almost, I mean, it's almost like a manifestation of civil society, because the United States has a long history of having a strong, active civil society that produces grassroots movements that advocate for, this, that, or the other reform or political change or what have you.
Mm.
So it kind of has similar characteristics to that. But at the same time, like you say, it also shares characteristics with, conspiracy theory groups, cults, and whatnot. So it's like a merger between the two. It's like American civil society mutated into that, whatever you want to call that. There's a long history of groups like that emerging. I mean, China, if you look at its history, has a long history of producing millenarian groups of one kind or another. Sometimes they kind of toe the line between historical revanchism, ethnic nationalism, millenarianism, and
What is millenarianism?
it's like end of the world.
Oh.
You think the world is going to end, and so you use that fact to rationalize forming a militia and trying to take over your area, or whatever other kind of behavior you want to justify. It's a reference to the expectation before 1000 AD in Europe that the world would end in the year 1000 and that Jesus Christ would return. And so there are a number of cultish movements that started up in anticipation of Jesus's return. And those groups came to be called millenarian groups.
Mm. So I have kind of a mixture in my family. I have some relatives who think that it's going to be soon and they're kind of pointing out signs and what have you. And then there are others who say that biblically it was meant to be something that could not be anticipated. Like there was no prediction of Christ is going to come back at this particular time. Like there will be stuff that happens around that time, but it's not something that you could plan for. So the recommendation for, I would say the majority of my Christian family was, you should live in a state of readiness where if Christ showed up, you would not be embarrassed by what he found you doing.
Pretty good advice, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm talking about. There were groups like that historically in China that generally popped up in periods of unrest and discontent, during periods of political and economic upheaval. Um, the Red Spear Society, the White Lotus Society, those are two that I can think of off the top of my head. To a degree, you can consider the Taiping to be a manifestation of that. I don't know if you've heard of the Taiping. Have you, Neuro?
No, what is that?
The Taiping were well, it actually started with one guy who failed China's civil service examination 3 times, I think it was. And he interacted to some degree with Christian missionaries in southern China. And after he failed the 3rd time, the civil service examination, he got the idea in his head that he was Jesus, basically reincarnated on Earth. I don't remember the exact argumentation, but he decided that he was Jesus and that he was going to lead a new Christian movement in China. And he was actually pretty successful in getting people to join his group, to the point where he was able to launch one of the largest, most violent rebellions in the history of China.
Whoa.
And this happened in the 1850s, I want to say. Chat can correct me on this. I want to say it was in the 1850s, and it was called the Taiping Rebellion, and it lasted into the early 1860s, and it killed just millions of people. It was immensely destructive. They actually made a lot of gains in the early part of the rebellion, but eventually the government was able to reverse the tide, partly with Western support. Westerners were kind of sympathetic to the rebellion at first because they were Christians, but the rebellion was pretty violent, and eventually they started to threaten Western interests in China, companies, financial interests, that kind of thing. And so there was a shift in favor towards the government. And so the government started getting more weapons and money in order to suppress the rebellion. So the Taiping can be considered a kind of cult in the traditional Chinese experience. So that's sort of the Chinese manifestation. In India, they kind of have something similar, roughly. They have gurus in India. So if you want to start a movement, you can just be a guru who has his own sort of philosophy or his own take on how to best live life. You can start your own thing completely free and clear, or you can kind of be derivative of a pre-existing philosophy that kind of ranges. Indian civilization and society is all about, variance and pluralism. So you can kind of do it any which way. So there's lots of examples in Indian history of people starting up their own little movements like this. But I don't know that they've historically tended to be very violent, because Indian culture is pretty accepting of gurus, so long as they adhere to sort of traditional norms of dharma and whatnot. So there's lots of them throughout Indian history that have manifested, regardless of circumstances. With China, it's been more in times of upheaval. In India, it's been a pretty constant variable. There's always been new groups like that right up to the present day. And so, I mean, both of these examples, I think, reflect the respective cultures. With China, they have such a top-down hierarchical system that when things go wrong, the people on the bottom really suffer a lot. And so that kind of manifests as some of these really militant cults that try to overthrow the government or try to become bandits so that they can feed their families. Whereas in India, they have a long history of sort of religious pluralism. And so in that sense, the cults kind of manifest in that form. So I guess the point I'm driving at here is that you can consider something like QAnon to be a unique manifestation of this behavior that manifests everywhere, that reflects American culture. And in America, our culture is very much predicated on civil society, political activism and participation. So maybe this is just, the American equivalent of like the Red Spear Society in China or gurus in India. It's taken something that already existed in American society, that being civil society, and manifested in a new way in response to a period of upheaval and new technology.
They're putting the cult in American culture.
Yep, so to speak. Yeah, I'd have to study more about QAnon to know more about just how it works.
It
'Cause
doesn't
it's not.
seem organized in the sense of like there's a
Yeah,
clear leader.
exactly.
It's like people post to 4chan, which most people would not consider 4chan to be the most reputable source of information, maybe even one of the worst. But yeah, that's like, I think where a lot of their initial traction was made.
What I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, but 4chan, it started on 4chan and then they actually got kicked out of 4chan.
That's crazy getting kicked off 4chan. Because 4chan already, I don't know if people have been there. It's a pretty gross place compared to a lot of, you would say, more curated spots of the internet with more strict rules and that kind of a thing. Yeah, getting kicked off 4chan. Wow.
Yeah.
They threw you out of the sewer because you were too gross.
Yeah, I think they were kicked out and then they started proliferating in alternative forums.
Hmm.
And so kind of took off from there. I don't know if the documentary mentioned that.
Hmm.
No, okay. I guess they were more focused on the people involved, right?
Yeah, they were interviewing people who either wrote books about it or, yeah, they kind of structured their life around it and how it's changed people. They've had some people who they feel like they lost their loved ones and relatives. Like they can't get their mom to stop browsing it. And that's all that person ever talks about. And it's kind of crazy. I think a lot of it is because the information that they spread is so urgent and dire that if it's true, like people need to act and like fix it now because it's crazy. But they also don't have really solid evidence for it either. So that's why it stays in the category of conspiracy theory instead of this is a problem that we've demonstrated. But some people, they
Yeah,
don't really need that evidence to believe in it.
yeah, movements like that depend really heavily on deductive reasoning. You know, they start with assumptions about how the government works and how corrupt it is, and, you know, the presence of extremists within the ranks, you know, fifth columnists. And then they work from there. They basically just find evidence to support those prepositions, or more accurately, they interpret events around them uh, through the by way of those assumptions, in terms of those assumptions. And so that's a that just reinforces the assumptions when you just do that over and over again.
Mm.
You know, basically, it's almost impossible to show them evidence that they're wrong because any evidence that you show them, they're going to interpret with the assumption that the government is infiltrated with, you know, pedophiles and Satanists and whatnot.
Lizard people.
Yeah. So, you know, when that's their starting assumption, it's really hard to change their mind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you really have to challenge the starting assumptions, but then they're extremely resistant to that.
Yeah,
So
a
if you
lot of
have
it
to,
a lot of
go
it I
ahead.
think is connected from argument from authority where if you believe that the person who is speaking is talking in good faith and they sound smart, then you'll be like, okay, this must be true. And they just kind of start building from there. And the more you build on an idea like that, the more entrenched you get in that domain of thinking, and the more you seek out stuff that confirms that. So you go from argument from authority bias to confirmation bias, and it ends up being a huge pile of bullshit that people just get stuck in. And if you
Yeah.
try to contest them on it, they can talk your ear off for hours and hours and hours because they have read so much stuff that they believe is all kind of pointing toward the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's difficult to kind of disprove any one of those items, but when they start gish galloping, that it's impossible. You know, the amount of workload that would go into creating cogent and clear arguments disproving each individual argument that they make is just very time and labor intensive. So it's a brick wall. It's an epistemological brick wall. Yeah, it also kind of makes it difficult because you know, it's easier to talk to people who share your own biases. So you tend to seek those out.
Yeah, it
You
feels
seek those
good too because we're
yeah.
being right together. Oof. Yes.
Yeah, and you tend to be more averse to interacting with people whom you know disagree with you. Because those experiences are not fun. It's not fun getting into an argument or feeling stupid or what have you. And so those discussions tend to be less of a priority, less sort of emotionally incentivized, if you will, than conversations with people who are basically just going to tell you that you're right or implicitly confirm the pre-existing bias you share. So there's an element of community building too that reinforces the behavior. You kind of want to be a part of a group, and so this allows you to do that and feel good about yourself and just kind of have fun and enjoy all of the fruits of being a part of some kind of larger movement or group, which is an experience that's getting harder and harder to get in alternative forums, so to speak. American society used to have a lot of local movements, local groups that you could join up and participate in. But, as the middle class has come under pressure, and especially as that pressure has been very focused on very particular geographies, a lot of those groups have disappeared, and it's become extremely difficult for people to kind of find meaning in their local community through these groups that traditionally provided that meaning. Yeah, there was a book called, I want to say it was Bowling for Columbine.
Yeah, that's a documentary, I think.
Yeah, but I think there was also a Steve Moore documentary that had a similar name. I'm thinking of a book. And I don't know, maybe the documentary was like an adaptation of the book, but there was a book basically that talked about this in greater detail. People interested could look that up and kind of learn more about it. But yeah, the weakening of American civil society is, an observable phenomenon. That's not abstract. So that lack of community makes movements like QAnon more attractive.
What do you mean, weakening of American society?
Weakening of American civil society. It's still pretty strong. I mean, we saw how resilient it was during the Trump administration. For 4 years, the administration, whether you approve of what they were trying to do or not, they definitely used legally circuitous approaches to trying to achieve objectives. And it really fell, in a lot of cases, to American civil society to help inhibit the damage from that. I remember way back in the first year of the Trump administration, one of the first things that the administration did was to pass the so-called Muslim ban. That's what it was called in the media. It was actually more just I can't even remember exactly what the technical term was but basically it was an emergency order to stop the processing of visas for people from certain countries that were designated to be dangerous, that there was a alleged terrorist threat emanating from those countries.
I thought it was for governments that had some level of instability in their governance, where it was like unsafe to travel there, so they also considered it unsafe for people to
no, that's a different thing. They do have the power to do that, but in this case it had more to do with the states in these countries being too weak to vet people in their country. Normally stable states can kind of engage in normal security law enforcement operations, and they can arrest people engaged in extremist activity. But if you live in a failed state, you don't really have a government doing that.
Right.
And so there's a slightly elevated risk from giving visas to the people from those countries and allowing them entrance into the United States. So goes the argumentation anyway. The Obama administration used the same law, implemented these same restrictions in response to Islamic State activity in the Middle East. So the Trump administration basically did the same thing. The argument against the Trump administration doing this is that they were doing it largely for political reasons, basically in response to a campaign promise that Trump made while he was running for office. The counter argument is that these places were genuinely dangerous, and again, the Obama administration did the same thing, so it's not completely unreasonable. But again, without relitigating all of the politics involved, there was a lot of people that didn't like it. And one of the things they did in response was to mobilize people at airports, specifically lawyers, in order to help people affected by the new restrictions. So that was a clear-cut example of American civil society responding to a perceived threat from, the government. and they were able to mitigate the damage that would have otherwise been done. A lot of people that were put out by the law or were, basically isolated in the United States, or who were stuck outside the United States, they were able to get legal advice for free, just because activists kind of jumped in and got involved. So that's an example of American civil society at work. And so it's pretty resilient, it's pretty strong, but at the local level, it's been hollowed out a little bit because the middle class in a lot of localities in the United States has itself been significantly impacted by structural changes to the economy. It's not true everywhere. There's a lot of the United States is a very large country, so there's a lot of variance in outcomes. So, definitely if you look at places like the large metropolitan cities, those places still have pretty strong civil society overall. I would argue there's definitely a lot of room for improvement, and there's even a fair amount of variance within metropolitan areas. But in general, pretty resilient. Whereas if you get more into the rural areas and some of the Rust Belt deindustrialized areas, some of those urban areas barely have any left at this point. So that's what I mean when I talk about the weakening of American civil society. There's been a pretty clear-cut deterioration, especially in certain localities.
Wait, so you're saying that there are good people who are doing their best effort to try to make America succeed?
There are.
That's crazy.
And I know that, well, I know it sounds mundane, right? It sounds obvious, but this is actually one of the things that gives the United States a big advantage. This isn't something you see in every country. Having a strong middle class that can participate politically and has the resources and education to do so effectively and impactfully, that's something that is not entirely uniquely American. I mean, Europe also has NGOs and civil society and whatnot. But in the United States, there's a lot more well, not lenience, but there's a lot more reliance on civil society like this to provide public services. Because in Europe, they have a much stronger social safety net. They have much larger, more robust welfare states. So the state in Europe generally provides a lot more services. And so American civil society kind of picks up some of the slack from that and helps provide welfare that in Europe would be provided by the state, basically. So in other words, American civil society kind of eases up some of the hard edges of American capitalism. Some of our very open, laissez-faire policy preferences kind of create social problems of one kind or another, and civil society is basically a response to those challenges. Historically, I think they've been more effective than they have been in the past couple decades, and I think that, again, comes down to structural economic changes. Just the sheer rapidity of technological, economic, and social change over the past 30, 40 years in the United States has utterly outstripped the ability of American civil society to adapt to it. And I think it'll adapt to it eventually, but I still think we're sort of in this transition phase where there's a lot more demand for social services than there is supply. And ideally, civil society would be able to provide that. Or alternatively, the state could jump in and provide it. But right now, neither is really sufficient to kind of meet all of the fallout from all of the policy, economic, etc. changes that have happened in the United States. So we're just in this awkward in-between phase where there's just a lot of basically misery that isn't being alleviated that could be. Exciting times.
Yeah. The format has changed with the web. We've talked about that quite a few times of if you have internet communication as opposed to just interpersonal face-to-face communication or even just like paper news, it's a lot easier to put information out there than it was in the past. You need less resource to make a post. Which means the signal to noise ratio is probably a bit worse. You get a greater variety of information, greater variety of opinion. You can learn stuff that's very far from where you currently are, And you can also get some pretty bad information. You can find people who share interests with you that are very, very niche. Like I was really into a Christian black metal forum when I was in my late teens. That's like the niche of the niche, because you're already selecting a really rare genre of music. And then in addition to that, you're adding a religious restriction of the band's spiritual orientation must be such and such for me to listen to it. So there may be 20 or so people on this forum, and we had lots of fun talking about the kind of music that we liked. But it's the kind of thing that requires the internet because we're from all over the world, and there are so few of us.
Yeah, that's one of the rewarding things about it. You know, whatever ills can be said of modern internet, it definitely gives a home to people who would not otherwise have one, socially speaking. Christian black metal. I have never heard of that.
Yeah, so black metal is very anti-Christian in a lot of its inception in Scandinavia. It was sort of a youth movement of people in Norway, Sweden, and Finland in the 90s, early 90s, late 80s, and so on. And there were church burnings and this kind of thing, and a lot of it was trying to throw off the importing of Christianity to Scandinavia. And I think some of it was just like the young adult, I'm feeling aggression and I want to do stuff with it. So that was a way to scare old people and be edgy. But it's a really enjoyable genre of music for me to listen to. When I was growing up, I didn't want to have any of those anti-Christian messages coming into me, so I kept it Christian only. And there are dozens of Christian black metal bands, actually 24 to be exact.
Mm-hmm. 24. Well, maybe I'll have to give it a listen at some point.
Yeah, I can just send you a link of what it sounds like, and you can peruse at your leisure.
Yeah, send me some samples.
Do you want the Christian kind or the non-Christian kind?
Give me the Christian kind.
All right.
I'm interested. Modernity is about nothing if not the perpetual hunt for novelty.
And I'll link it here in the chat if people are curious.
I had a really good set of notes that was relevant to that. I'm having trouble finding it. There we go. I knew it was around here somewhere. This is a story I've been sitting on for a while. I never really had much reason to talk about it. Let me see. So there was a guy. This is from 2019, I want to say. So there was a guy named Holden Matthews who was arrested in 2019 because he burned 3 black churches in Louisiana. And he ended up admitting to hate charges that were brought against him, obviously. So his trial wasn't held until 2020. And when the trial ended, the hate charges had actually been dropped. And as it happened, he was a member of a black metal band called the Vodka Vultures. And apparently, he was trying to impress people in the black metal music scene in his area by burning the churches, which was apparently a reference to similar events that had happened in the early 90s.
In Norway, yeah.
In Norway, yeah, exactly. There was a bunch of black metal fans there in the early 90s who attacked churches. Mm-hmm. Apparently about 50 Christian churches in Norway at the time were attacked by arsonists in the name of quote-unquote black metal. He was still found guilty of stuff. He was guilty of 3 counts of arson on religious buildings and then 1 count of using fire to commit a federal felony. So, still went to jail, but the hate charges were dropped. It ended up being just an obscure reference.
Yeah, it's interesting how the community has changed. They have a black metal subreddit on Reddit, and they have lots of posts about this kind of thing when they happen. And I would probably say that the community overall is opposed to that kind of behavior. They'll say, "Man, what a fucking asshole!" Like if you're making black metal, it's the music is the primary thing. Your aesthetic and like how tough and edgy you are, like that's something, but you don't have to destroy property to do stuff that's badass. A lot of black metal toughness and the machismo and stuff is cold themed, where it's about walking through a blizzard and things like this, and it's more like the climate aspect of Scandinavia, and part of why Finland has so many black metal bands per capita. I think they have more metal bands per capita than any other country in the world, and it's for two reasons. It's dark all the time in the winter, and it's cold as fuck. So you've got lots of stuff that's pretty intense and negative that you could make metal music about that isn't really related to harming anyone else. But there are certainly bands who will take the edgy sound of music and they'll make a hateful message out of that.
Subcultures begetting subcultures.
Yep.
Did you ever see the, speaking about aesthetic versus music, did you ever see the Finnish black metal band that won Eurovision?
Do you know what the name of the band is?
Lordi?
Lordi?
Yeah.
I don't know.
This would have been, I guess, back in 2006. I think they were easily the first. They were the first black metal band to win Eurovision, if not the first metal band in general. I know some of the Europeans listening would know better than I would. Anyway, they were, I get the music was good, obviously, I assume. I'm not a auteur of black metal, so I wouldn't know, but the notable thing about them was their presentation. They had a lot of charisma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they had these interesting costumes and whatnot. It was a real theatrical performance they put on.
Yeah, to quote Fuzzy Cord, they're kind of a cheesy band. What genre would they be exactly? If they have a specific one, do you know?
I have no earthly idea. I could not tell you.
We're asking Fuzzy Cord. He's actually our resident music expert. We did our music theory 101 thing, and he kind of broke down how you create the sound of metal music, basically by just chopping away at the sound waves and making them a lot less smooth and more jagged.
Wow. Interesting.
Family-friendly guar. Oh. So maybe more like power metal than black metal? There are so many different kinds. It's really funny for people who aren't into metal. They're like, what? But it all sounds the same. It's just some guy yelling. Yeah. And similarly, if there's someone who's like a bourbon or whiskey enthusiast, and they're like, oh, this is the good stuff, and oh, Jack Daniels, oh, that's crap. And for someone who doesn't drink whiskey, they're like, this is all gross to me. And it all basically tastes like whiskey.
I sent you a YouTube link. You can watch that later. Not on stream, but like in your own time. Get an idea of what they're about.
Mm-hmm.
You may remember them, because they were in the news a bit. It was definitely a very weird event. I'm sure it made the rounds on the internet, if nothing else. Let's see, what else did we want to get to today?
We have a couple questions in the queue at the moment.
Oh, okay. Now, before I forget, let me just put out the usual disclaimer here. Obviously, painfully obviously at times, I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have stronger expertise in some areas than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, I would encourage chat to correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So please do contribute that in chat. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I will see it eventually. Let's see. So with that in mind, is there anything being done to reunite families and close the immigrant camps on the border? Has there been any immigration policy changes in the past 10 months? Yes, there's been a lot of changes, but not as many as you might think. The Biden administration kind of knows. I mean, the whole gist of the Biden administration is to be middle of the road, to be moderate. And you can pretty easily tell that they've gone out of their way from the start, since Biden got into office, that they're trying to, on the one hand, appease the people that got them into office, appease their core constituents on the political left, but they're also trying to give credence to populists of one sort or another. I think the administration is just very wary, if not outright paranoid, about the 2016 election and about the fact that, there was this populist movement that was able to win out. And so I kind of sense that they're going out of their way to try to alleviate some populist political pressure in the United States by trying to give concessions to that group in a variety of ways. And one of those ways is that they've maintained a lot of the Trump administration's approach to managing the border. And so there hasn't been a whole lot of change in that regard. For the most part, they've continued to do, Title 42 deportations. There's a whole long list. I think I've got it. I think I've actually got the list here somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, actually, I moved it today, didn't I? One of my projects here that I've been trying to do since the start of 2021 is that I've been trying to gather, examples and information and data and whatnot, trying to build a bigger picture of how the United States as a whole, and specifically how US politics as a whole, is responding to the events of the Trump administration. Because that was a pretty dramatic break from what came before. From 26 to 2020, we had a very different approach to politics, obviously. So I was very curious to see how, if there was going to be a change in government, which there was, how they would respond to that. How do you respond to the rise of populism? How do you respond to a restive, dissatisfied polity? And, how they did that wasn't just important to policy outcomes, it was also important to determining how likely it would be that we would return to either another Trump administration or something like another Trump administration. So, sort of the bigger picture, the bigger question I'm kind of asking is, can the United States political establishment, so to speak, diffuse populist pressure, or is populist pressure irreversible, basically, and is that sort of predestined to become the future of American politics? So in Europe, they've had similar populist pressures, but they've largely diffused them by giving lots of concessions on immigration. They weren't willing to give way on stuff like, Euro bonds and the broader European project, which was kind of in danger for a while because of the Eurozone crisis. But they eventually did give a lot of ground in terms of restricting immigration and tightening up borders and that kind of thing. So that has not completely diffused populist pressure in Europe, but it's definitely taken a lot of the wind out of their sails, so to speak. So in the United States, I kind of expected something similar to be done with mostly environmentalism, because that kind of makes more sense in the political calculus here. But it was inevitable that they would also do immigration as well, that they would probably implement some variety of tougher immigration policy in order to, again, diffuse some of that pressure. And the Biden administration has largely done that. That's pretty much kept with my expectations. They've definitely done some stuff to appease the political left in the United States. That's mostly, I think, come in the form of executive orders that were passed in like the first, week of the administration. Basically, any given, well, not even any given, just pretty much all of the major executive orders that the Trump administration issued over the course of the 4 years of the Trump administration were reversed in the first week of the Biden administration just by executive writ. Executive orders are pretty easy to reverse. You just need another executive order. So, no shock that the Biden administration kind of made that a priority. So that was one of the big gives, so to speak, one of the big achievements, if you like, that was given in deference to left-wing constituents in the United States. But there hasn't necessarily been a lot of follow-up. I don't know that there's been a whole lot of substantive change. Let me see here. This list is kind of too long to really just pick through in detail. There was a Kamala? Wait, is it Kamala Harris or Kamala Harris? I always forget.
I think it's Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris. Okay, so Kamala Harris was kind of given the responsibility, for this issue, and she's kind of been trying to focus on root issues, so to speak. The kind of the root driving factors that are causing the immigration problem, so to speak, and mixed success, obviously. I mean, just there's only so much you can do. Just problems of corruption and weak civil society and other such issues in Central America are not problems that you can change by pushing a button or signing a check. Those are pretty deeply rooted structural issues within those societies. It's smart to try to address them. I'm not saying it's the wrong approach, but it's definitely more of a long-term approach. It's not something that's going to produce results like in a couple of months or even a couple of years. So that's been more their gist. But in terms of the stuff that leftist activists were most interested in, like alleviating the suffering of people stuck on the border, or the kids in cages issue, the children who are separated from their families and are held in detention camps for sometimes prolonged periods of time. There hasn't been as much change on that. In general, that's continued. And to be fair, that was something that administrations, even before the Trump administration, were doing. The Trump administration kind of got blamed disproportionately for that. But the Biden administration has kind of continued those policies, not only out of practicality, but also just to kind of appease populist pressure, because there's still a lot of upset in the United States politics about how porous the border is and just immigration in general. Still doing Title 42. Deportations are still pretty high. There just hasn't really been the kind of shift towards what the left would consider a humanitarian approach to dealing with the problem. So I think a lot of people on the left are disappointed in that regard. I think in general, people on the left are disappointed in many regards with the Biden administration. This is just one of them.
Well, I think a lot of that is because, like you were saying, he's not really the candidate who's going to take the presidential office and drive the country to the left. He's basically trying to appease the right and the left.
Yeah, that's the trouble. That's the problem. It's given how partisan American politics is right now, it's just very difficult to appease both wings of American politics. So it's an unenviable task for sure. But he has made the effort. I think for the most part, this is about as good as he can do on this. There's always going to be conservatives who are going to be very upset with anything less than a very robust, strong policy effort to shut down the border. Not completely, but shut it down to the point where crossings are significantly, if not completely, curtailed. So that element of the right is just always going to be angry, because I don't think that's ever really going to happen. But then the left is also going to be disappointed because, again, the kind of humanitarian approach is not going to happen either. It's just, for practical reasons, it's expensive, it's difficult. Kids in cages isn't just a matter of trying to deter people from coming. There's definitely a strong element of that, but it also just comes down to needing to put people somewhere. You gotta keep the kids. I mean, unless you want to release the children into the community, which I'm sure a lot of people want to do, the only alternative is to detain them somewhere. And so, given the lack of infrastructure on the border to do that, you end up with gaps. What's the word I want? Gap stop measures, like the camps. Generally, they're not as bad when there's not as many, but when there's a big wave, it piles on, and then you end up with overcrowding, which is where a lot of the worst problems happen.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. There's just a whole bunch of, there's a lot of litigation involved with this too. A lot of the stuff that the Trump administration did ended up in court. But the courts move relatively slowly, and so a lot of the decisions, which generally were not favorable, but a lot of the decisions were not actually made until like the past 6 months. So, there were cases brought against executive orders and decisions from 2017, 2018 that were not resolved in the courts until like very recently. There's just a lot of stuff. Due process violations, third country rules, special administration rules for children, health provisions, asylum rules, third country transit bans, the prompt asylum claim review, humanitarian asylum review program, DACA, safe third country agreements. It's just, like I said, it's a really long list of stuff to get through just off the fly, and I haven't looked at these notes in a long time. So I can't really summarize them quickly. But basically, most of these programs are still in place. The Biden administration did or has adjusted them either in response to court rulings or on its own initiative in order to try to make them a little more palatable, basically, to the administration's core constituents. But in general, the overall approach of trying to implement programs that deter people from coming by making the process of processing claims more difficult, or making deportations more easy, or lowering the bar for who qualifies for deportation. That's kind of the gist of a lot of these programs that were implemented during the Trump administration. So the Biden administration has largely continued to use that approach, even if some of the specific details have been somewhat adjusted. So that's kind of a compromise approach. It's not going to please everybody, but it has proven relatively effective in either processing people into the United States or deporting them out of the United States. I don't know that there's a lot of camps right now on the border. There was a big wave of Haitians a while ago, but that's largely depleted since then. And so unless there's been another wave I'm not aware about, which is possible, I'm not aware of any new camps of asylum seekers on the border that have accumulated since then. So it's not as much of a problem as it was. I'm sure it will be again. I think I was reading a couple weeks ago or months ago about another wave coming up. They move relatively slowly, so you can generally see them coming. I guess the question here was, has there been anything done to reunite families and close the immigrant camps? There has been action to close the camps. Again, it's kind of been a mixed bag as to how successful that's been. As far as reuniting families, the Biden administration did issue an executive order really early on that tried to make that a priority, but I have no idea what kind of follow-up with that it's been. It's probably going to be pretty difficult to do. You're probably going to see more action in terms of making sure something like that doesn't happen again. For those of you who maybe don't know what I'm talking about, there was a policy in place during the Trump administration to separate children of asylum seekers from their parents. And, some of that was kind of justified with, again, pre-existing policy. It was not unheard of that to happen, but the administration played it up and made it easier for the Border Patrol to do that. And the idea was basically to use it as a deterrent. People coming up from Central America generally, well, not generally, but not uncommonly bring their children with them. And so the idea was to scare parents into thinking that, maybe they wouldn't see their children again if they had tried to get into the United States. So that was the deterrent effect that they were trying to implement there. And of course, there was a big outcry. People really were uncomfortable with a lot of the imagery that came out of that policy of large, overcrowded, basically cages, detainment facilities, just full of children who had been separated from their parents. So there was a lot of upset for that. Some of it was kind of overblown, but genuine. It was genuine. There was genuine upset over that and a desire to change that. And over the course of the processing of those children in those facilities, a number of them were released into the public to people whom the government did not record. Well, let me rephrase that. When the children were released into the public, the government did not record who they were releasing them to. Generally, they just gave them over to relatives or, basically whomever. But it's not known exactly who they were released to. And so there was some angst at the time that maybe the children were being released to traffickers or organized criminals or whomever, basically without any kind of record. It's impossible to really track down the children and see what happened to them. So there was a desire anyway, to try to get the government to find the children who were kind of basically lost, bureaucratically speaking, and to try to reunite them with their original families. Again, some of that is redundant because in a lot of cases they probably were just released to family members who were already in the United States. A lot of them were probably undocumented, so they didn't want to be tracked, and so it would be hard to find them. But again, without any kind of record, it's impossible to know exactly how many were released to family members and who were not. So there's a desire to try to undo that, to basically right the wrong, so to speak. So again, I don't know how much follow-up the Biden administration has implemented to actually do that. Again, it would be very difficult given that a lot of the people in question don't want to be found in the first place. But I think there's been a lot more action just to try to make sure that they do better in terms of releasing children to people that they know are related to them and are not going to abuse them or what have you. Let's see. So yeah, that's kind of a rough take there, but I think that's relatively comprehensive in so much as I can do so while being very general. If I ever don't answer a question to the questioner's satisfaction, they should feel free to elaborate and ask again, and I'm happy to return to it. I don't always do the best at reading questions and getting to the point of them. Let's see. So the next question was, have I ever read or does he have an opinion on the book Why Nations Fail? I think I've heard of it, but I have not read it. And I don't know that I remember the principal arguments made in the book. Generally when books like this are released, they kind of, some of the key ideas percolate in academic circles, and so sometimes you're exposed to the main ideas just through book reviews and articles and what have you, but it's been too long for me to remember what I've read about the book to even be able to comment on it. So I'll have to punt on the question there. That's not a very satisfying answer, but it's an honest one. Let's see. What was done in the Bush era? Didn't immigration peak then? I don't think so. I think immigration continued. Well, actually, yeah, it did. It would have. So the thing that really impacted immigration significantly in the United States, especially immigration from Mexico, was the financial crisis in 2008. There was a pretty dramatic fall in immigration after that. And for obvious reasons, I mean, if you're going to try to get into the United States legally or illegally, you're generally coming here to get a job, right? Because there's opportunities here. But after the '08 financial crisis, the U.S. economy just tanked. There was a significant fall off in economic activity. And at that point, there was not a whole lot of incentive to make the trip. And the collapse in incentive resulted in a dramatic fall in crossings across the border, both legal and illegal. So I don't know that the Bush administration really did anything actively to try to curtail immigration other than the usual, repertoire of more money for the Border Patrol and, more cameras and infrastructure along the border, that kind of thing.
Didn't they do the border fence under Bush in Texas?
I'm sure they did some of it. I don't know how much. Any kind of border infrastructure, basically. Cameras, motion sensor equipment, and fencing. of one kind or another would have fit the bill. But basically, conservative governments over the past couple decades, up until the Trump administration anyway, did not really take the border issue all that seriously. And most of the policy prescriptions they implemented were largely stopgaps that were meant more to appease their constituents than they were to actually have a substantive policy impact. That was one of the things that really the Trump administration, well, the Trump campaign, in 2015, 2016, was really able to capitalize on, because there was a lot of upset on the part of conservatives in the United States for whom immigration was a core issue. So that was a ready-made constituency for Donald Trump to exploit. But yeah, I don't know that the Bush era can really be, I don't know that the Bush administration can really be said to have done anything in particular that caused the significant decrease in immigration that happened in 2008, 2009. I think that had more to do with economic developments, specifically the financial crisis. If somebody in chat can correct me on that, if I'm wrong, I would appreciate it, but that is my impression as of now anyway. Let's see, what percentage of claims processed result in asylum? What was done with those folks in the past? Conditional follow-on, if the percentage was low, what is the upside of slowing the processing down? Was it to reduce repeated crossings? Okay, so the percentage of claims processed resulting in asylum. Right now, that's pretty low, because in general, whenever there's a big wave, like a caravan or something like that, whenever there's a big wave of people trying to get in as asylum seekers, generally most of the applications end up getting rejected and they end up getting deported. That was the case with the big Haitian wave recently. I don't want to discount that a lot of people were allowed in. I'm sure there's activists who would be upset about that, but in general, most of them were deported or had their asylum applications rejected. So during waves like that, I'm sure the rate is much lower. So I'm not sure what the rate would be outside of that. And I would have to look up the exact number. I don't have it in my notes here. I'd have to find it. But it's relatively high from what I remember reading. I remember reading about it and thinking, okay, that's higher than I was expecting. So let's see. But I can't give you the exact number. What was done with those folks in the past? I mean, historically, if somebody applied for asylum, I'm going to try to remember this. The process was not different. What's different is just the specifics of how it's done. They try to, in order to deter people from applying in the first place, they'll try to make the process as unattractive and difficult as possible. And also by rejecting relatively more, they also try to use that as a disincentive as well. So the actual process, is not different. The process is that if you apply for asylum, then basically you'll be housed, detained or, put in a facility or some such. And then they will give you they'll interview you and they'll try to ascertain the validity of your asylum claim, because you can't just pop up and say, I want asylum. You have to have some reason. So there will be an interview with a Border Patrol officer, as I understand it, and then they will judge. They have discretion basically to judge the veracity of the claim. And then if they determine that your claim is substantive, then you go on to the next phase of processing, which involves the judicial system. You'll go before a judge and they'll ascertain the substance of the claim, whether or not you qualify, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you meet the necessary criteria, then they will give you a temporary visa, an asylum seeker's visa, and let you into the country, whereupon there will be basically further hearings. I don't think the process ends there, but I'm not as familiar with the latter stages. And it's also possible that your visa can be revoked, in the future, depending on circumstances. But roughly, that's like a very rough description of the process as I'm remembering it. So what you can do is you can just make the different stages of that more difficult. Like when the Border Patrol officer does the interview, you can give them greater discretion to decline people, basically. You can have a very high bar for what constitutes a valid asylum claim. And so you can reduce claimants that way, because if you can shut them down at the stage of the interview, then that significantly reduces workload.
Right. So you can only join if you can do one-arm push-ups and recite the alphabet backwards.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to have a compelling enough story, basically. So then at the later stage, when they're sitting with the judge, you can make the criteria necessary to qualify very restrictive and difficult to meet. And so that also restricts that can also restrict the flow of asylum seekers that qualify. So, there's a whole bunch of other, entities, and there's a whole lot of other rules that are implemented. I think the third country transit rule, I think I briefly mentioned that before. So that rule basically says that if you're from, say, Honduras, for example, and you want to apply for asylum in the United States, you have to apply from Honduras. You can't travel to Mexico and then apply on the border between the United States and Mexico. So if you do that, then you're just instantly disqualified. That was a rule that the Trump administration tried to implement, I think, in like 2018, 2019, maybe. And I think it's since been shot down by the courts. The courts decided that that was not legal. I don't know exactly how it was illegal. That gets more into the necessary legislation that I'm familiar with. It wasn't necessarily unconstitutional. It may just have been in violation of the APA, which, maybe isn't all that different, but, effect is the same. The rule gets shot down. But that's just an example of the kind of rule that you can implement in order to deter people. It's relatively difficult to apply for asylum within Honduras because, whatever factor exists in the country that made you want to apply in the first place, you're going to have to continue to deal with for the duration of the asylum process. So that can act as a deterrent in and of itself, since a lot of people who are, genuinely seeking asylum and who are not like economic migrants, people who are genuinely seeking asylum are trying to get away from something. And if you force them basically to endure that during the application process with no guarantee that you'll even get asylum in the end, that can lead people to look for alternative avenues to try to deal with whatever problem it is they're trying to deal with. So let's see, conditional follow-on to the question, if the percentage was low, which I think it was, what is the upside of slowing the process down? Was it to reduce repeating crowds? Yeah, I think I kind of addressed that. Yeah, just the whole idea of gumming up the works of the process is to prolong the process as much as possible to make it as difficult for people to endure as possible. Because while you're waiting for your application to be processed, you're either sitting in some camp in Mexico, which is very difficult. The conditions in the camps are like very bad. Or you're in a facility in the United States, being detained, in which case you're not making any money and you're just sort of stuck in place. The conditions are not great. It's better than being in Mexico, but it's not ideal. And, the whole time you're there, you don't really know what's going to happen to you. You don't have easy access to your family. It's just a very uncertain position to be in, and it's not very comfortable. Now, to be fair, some of the stuff that the U.S. government does as far as dealing with this problem are done more to expedite applications. So basically, if they're making it more difficult, it's not just because they just don't want people coming. It's also because they want to limit the flow of administrative work. Because when there's a huge surge in applications, it overwhelms, very readily the capacity of the U.S. government to process them. So some of the delays that are happening are not just purposeful delays being implemented to make the experience painful and to act as a deterrent. Some of it is just legitimate difficulty processing large numbers of applications. So in that sense, some of the stuff the government has done under both Trump and Biden administrations has been to try to reduce the strain on the government in terms of just processing the applications in general, rather than just, say, malice.
We haven't fixed this because we refuse to. We haven't fixed this because it's hard.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, some of that you could say is by design. We really should invest more in the capacity of the federal government to process paperwork. The counter argument is that it would be better not to have the paperwork in the first place. So, there's some truth to that. But in so much as there's just large groups of people who are just sort of stuck in place, waiting for their asylum application or waiting for, a green card or, for citizenship. That stuff really should not take as long as it does. So I think there's a decent argument to be made that there should be more work done to invest in capacity there. But in so much as you don't want more immigrants, then it actually makes sense to starve those agencies of resources, because if they can't process as many applications to get into the United States, then, logically speaking, fewer people will be coming into the United States. So that's kind of a way of circuitously implementing a policy preference. You're not passing a law decreasing the number of immigrants that are allowed in or changing the asylum application criteria. You're just kind of trying to starve the beast, so to speak, restricting the ability to process applications such that you end up with your preferred outcome without legislation. In general, as there's been more legislative gridlock in the United States, administrative battles like this have become a lot more common, which is unfortunate because that's not how policymaking is supposed to work. But when you have hyperpartisanship as grievous as it is in the United States, it's probably inevitable. Let's see. So the next question, what do you think about the French-Australian submarine fallout? I think it's mostly theater. We talked about this last time. I mean, I think Emmanuel Macron is trying to run for re-election right now, and the race is, he'll probably win, but the race is tighter than he would be comfortable with. It's sufficiently tight that he's not going to take his foot off the pedal. He's going to go hard. And that being the case, losing a big contract like that inherently required some kind of substantive response. He couldn't just say, oh, yeah, well, we weren't really adhering to the deal sufficiently well to really make it worthwhile for the Australians to stick with it. So, yeah, that's on us. He was never going to say that. So he has to do something in response to kind of get back at them in order to kind of look strong. And so I think the political theatrics are more driving the French response at this point than any real guttural sense of being wronged. Certainly the French themselves have a long history of doing similar things. They were a principal participant in the development of a main battle tank in Europe in the 1970s, in cooperation with the Germans and Belgians and I think some other participants. And sort of near the end of the program, they just sort of up and left and decided to develop their own main battle tank. And that kind of left some of their participants in the lurch a little bit. They did the same thing with the development of the Eurofighter. They were originally participants in that and then later on pulled out of the program because they wanted to use the technology they helped develop as part of the program to develop their own fighter, which turned into the Rafale. So, it's not like they haven't done stuff like this too. The development of new technologies, new weapon systems, that's always a pretty mercenary public policy program, whenever that happens. So, if the French are freaking out, it's not because I think that they feel like they've really been just wronged. I think it really is just French politics more than anything. That's not to say that the Biden administration or the Australian government couldn't have done more in order to prep the French government for it. But like I was saying last week, even if they had done more to prepare the French government for it, they still would have had to freak out just for political reasons, just again, because there's an election coming up and they need to look good.
I'm legally bound to freak out in this situation in order to get the right amount of votes for the upcoming election.
Well, that's what it is. That's just how the game theory works out. When you're in a position like that, sometimes you just have to make a show of things. What school of economics do you consider yourself to subscribe to and why? What other schools of economics do you find persuasive? Can you comment on post-Keynesianism in particular? I don't subscribe to any at this point. Just all of them have merits. All of them have costs and benefits. I mean, it's not really about ideology at this point. It's more about the math. I don't know how up-to-date people are with economics, but there was a big revolution in academics, or economics as an academic discipline, in the 1980s. And that revolution was empirical in nature. There was a big shift towards quantitative analysis and away from qualitative analysis. And that was done to make the science more rigorous. When it's more qualitative, There's a lot more room for creativity, and you can kind of get into more the political side of economics, but it also made it really difficult to come to hard conclusions, and it made it hard for people to debate with each other because everybody kind of had their own definitions and their own uh, research, their own priorities, blah blah blah. So when you have more of a quantitative approach, when you have more of a hard math approach, then you have hard numbers to work with, and it's easier to draw hard conclusions. They're not always applicable outside of academia. Sometimes those hard conclusions come with a lot of caveats that limit their applicability. But it makes it much easier for people in academia to kind of debate with each other and understand their different perspectives and approaches and whatnot. So that quantitative revolution has resulted in economics as a discipline being a lot more about modeling and a lot about analysis, regression analysis and whatever other kind of quantitative, approaches that you want to take. Those are much more the gist of modern economics now, rather than sort of more abstract theories, like you saw kind of more in the early 20th century. So, for me, economics isn't about which, school of economics fits my politics. It's more about who has the best research, because that's actually pretty quantifiable at this point. And every school of economics, they still exist. There are still different schools with different approaches and different preferences and different assumptions and whatnot. But generally, you can just pick out the research that you think is the strongest and say, okay, that research has a good point. I think I would, implement that as part of a policy or would recommend that in a public policy context. I think that's the healthier approach to economics at this point, rather than sort of hitching your wagon to one specific school and, trying to push for them regardless of the quality of the research. Let's see, what other schools of economics? I mean, I guess I would merge this with the next part of the question. Can you comment on post-Keynesianism in particular? Uh, Keynesianism is not really relevant. What's relevant now to modern economics is more neo-Keynesianism. And neo-Keynesianism, like I mentioned before, is a lot more quantitative in nature. It focuses a lot more on, rigorous quantitative analysis. So if you want to get into neo-Keynesianism, you're going to get in a lot into things like modeling, like hard modeling, really long models with weird variables that are very complicated to optimize. That's more the stuff you're looking at as far as neo-Keynesianism. And, for those interested, that's the kind of stuff that the Federal Reserve does. Central banks in general lean a lot on models in order to guide their approach to setting interest rates and setting guidance and stuff like that. So neo-Keynesianism has the advantage of it's mostly a macroeconomic discipline, as I understand it. So it has the advantage of having a lot of public policy utility that is easily translatable into policy actions by central banks or the Federal Reserve in America's case. So that would be their strength. There's also the Chicago School of Economics, which is very laissez-faire and focuses a lot more on trying to illustrate how government interference is not useful in a lot of cases. Basically, they tend to give a lot more leeway to market concentration than other schools would. So they've made some pretty good contributions. There's also other schools that are not maybe as readily known, stuff that focuses on industrial policy or, trust busting, anti-monopoly. I'm not as familiar with those. If you want to go back to political economy, stuff by Hayek is generally pretty good, just because it's relatively well reasoned. It's definitely not for everybody. That whole Austrian school of economics is definitely not quantitative in nature. That's definitely more philosophical in nature. But they had a pretty elegant set of arguments for illustrating things like creative destruction, which is the process by which economic activity, well, more specifically, certain industries. It accurately describes the process by which industries obsolesce and die out and are replaced by new industries and new technologies. So they tried to describe the economy in organic terms, and I think they did a pretty good job with that. That's not what's the word I want, endorsement per se, but I would say that the argumentation is pretty good, and in that sense is attractive. So, if you're more interested in like the political economy side of economics or the philosophical side, something like the Austrian School of Economics or mid 20th century Keynesianism is more what you're looking for. But in terms of like modern academic stuff, then you're looking more for stuff like neo-Keynesianism, maybe the Chicago School, and other equivalents. And as far as what's persuasive, I mean, it just depends on what you want. Like, I maintain that in public policy, politicians don't listen to economists. They don't really care what we think. What they're looking for is justification for stuff that they were going to do anyway. If they want to increase the size of government and spend more money on this, that, or the other, or if they want to gut the size of government and cut spending on this, that, or the other, that's all stuff that they wanted to do for ideological reasons or for parochial reasons or just to give red meat to their base, as a form of pandering. If economists can come along and give them a very well-reasoned, rationalized reason for doing that stuff, all the better. But if they didn't have those reasons, then they were still going to do them. So, economists and economic logic and analysis is more ornamentation to a lot of political doings rather than sort of the gist of it, rather than the driver. I sometimes don't think people really fully understand that. Sometimes I see people getting mad at economists, like we're the ones that are doing this, like we're determining policy. I assure you that we're not. We would run things very differently if we were. No, a lot of that is just politics that is masquerading as cost-benefit analysis. So as far as what's persuasive, whatever school of thought, I mean, what people are going to do anyway, regardless of what I say here, is they're going to find whichever school of thought aligns with their pre-existing political biases, and they're going to latch onto those to basically deductively reason their way to justifying what they believe. That's, in general, what everybody does in politics.
So what you're saying is you're basically the Bruce Lee of these kinds of theories, where you take what is useful, discard what is useless from any given theory, and you're not a firebrand from one particular school.
Well, I would not be so brazen as to compare myself to Bruce Lee in that manner. I'm not sufficiently familiar with all of the schools of economics to say that I pick and choose what's best from each school in order to try to understand what's going on. I have a familiarity with the schools based off of my time in grad school, but that was a long time ago. And that was not really my focus while I was there. I was more interested in things like international trade, democratization, modernization theory, stuff like that. That was more political economy. But yeah, the approach you describe is definitely one I would recommend. I think that's the better approach, to just take the best from each field and try to fit it into public policy as necessary, basically. That's if you were trying to be optimal, basically. If you wanted to try to create optimal economic policy, and you were trying to do so regardless of political preferences, in so much as that's possible with something as sensitive as regulating the economy, then yeah, that would be the better approach. Which economic models do you favor then? DSGE, ISLM, stock flow consistent? I don't really have a preference. I don't really favor them per se. Like stuff like ISLM, I think is a little archaic.
What is that?
ISLM kind of is an older macroeconomic theory that tries to describe aggregate demand, if I'm remembering it correctly, and I may not be. Chat should definitely correct me on this stuff. But yeah, from my memory is conjuring aggregate demand. So basically, it's trying to describe that. And there's a lot of sort of questionable assumptions. Economics kind of has to make questionable assumptions. We can't really have an experiment where we control all of the variables in the economy in order to see how everything works. So we're forced to make assumptions in order to produce models that can provide actionable, impactful, useful conclusions. So the thing to keep in mind about economic models is that, yes, there are questionable assumptions, but that doesn't mean that they don't produce useful conclusions. It just means that you have to keep in mind that the conclusions are limited in scope. And any good economist writing a paper will factor that into their conclusions. They'll write into their conclusions that, in general, evidence points to this, but there's a lot of caveats, and then they'll describe those caveats depending on the limitations of the model they're using. So that's what good economic research looks like in general, again, broadly speaking. So ISLM, to kind of get back to that, it's just kind of old, and a lot of the assumptions are just kind of weird. And well, maybe not weird per se, but the trouble with ISLM is that it just builds assumption on assumption on assumption, to the point where by the time you get to the final conclusions, the applicability to public policy making is a little bit limited. Doesn't mean it's not useful for, in general, describing how different stimuli affect the economy. It is useful for that still. But as far as like, you know, contemporary research relevant to public policy making, I don't know how useful it is for that. And, you know, if we have macroeconomists in chat who are maybe more up to date on it, they can feel free to critique that assessment. But that is my impression right now. And, you know, DSGE, that's a general, you know, again, if I'm not mistaken, that's a discrete general equilibrium model. That's kind of more what I studied when I was taking macroeconomics in grad school. I want to say that's a real business cycle model, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a more accurate description, I think, of economic activity than something like ISLM, for example. And I think Federal Reserve uses something like a real business cycle model to kind of determine their policy prescriptions. It's obviously it's very esoteric and, you know, very rooted in economic research, to the point where I'm not really familiar with the exact models that they use, but I think the base of the models they're using are general equilibrium models like DSGE. So, you know, the models that are produced from macroeconomics are useful for broad description and provide sufficiently focused public policy prescriptions that, you know, public policy people can use them. But at the same time, macroeconomics in general has a lot of limitations as far as, you know, just how much you can accurately capture all of the economic activity happening within, you know, something as large and intricate as the U.S. economy. So in that sense, you know, I would critique them on that count, I guess. You know, I mean, when it comes to public policy, it's useful just to give you rough direction, but the details are somewhat lacking. And sometimes macroeconomists like get too into the models, and then they give like really weird advice. Like, you know, the one that I'm always seeing is like the need to, what was it, boost savings, I think. It has to do with, it's been too long since I've read about it. It has to do with currency, basically. Like if you're too import dependent, like the United States is, because of the current accounts deficit, one of the ways you can restore balance to trade is by basically cutting spending. And so you can increase savings, and the way the models work, that can help with the current accounts deficit. And it just gets really esoteric to the point where they're basically recommending forcing people to consume less in order to deal with it. And I don't think that's very actionable from a public policy perspective. I'm sure there's stuff at the margin you can do to inhibit, you know, total consumer spending in the United States, but it would be politically unpopular, and I don't know how effective it would be. And it seems like if balancing the trade deficit is a public policy priority, there's probably better ways to do that than trying to implement some kind of consumer tax of one kind or another. You know, you could just increase tariffs, or, you know, there's any number of approaches you could use to do that. A lot of them political in nature, and thereby, you know, sort of outside the ambit of economics, which is probably why they get so esoteric in the first place. But, you know, nonetheless, I would critique macroeconomists for sometimes just being a little too defined and driven by their models, rather than kind of expanding their analysis into more of a big picture view that encompasses more of a political economy view. But that's just me. I think that's all we have for questions. Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah. Gonna go for another half hour. That's good.
Okay. Well, did you hear about the infrastructure bill?
Yes. Vaguely, but I don't know the details.
Well, guess what I have for you.
The details of the infrastructure bill.
Now, to be honest, I haven't done all of the reading I want to do about this. One of the other mini side projects that I have going right now is that I want to look at all of the major spending bills that have been passed since COVID-19 broke out, and I want to look at all of the stuff they spent money on.
Hmm.
That's a very difficult project because it's a lot of money. I think I had a data point that if you accumulate all of the major COVID bills together, the total spending would be more than the GDP of Germany in a given year.
Oh,
It's a lot of dough.
yeah.
And it went to a lot of different projects. And so trying to get even just a rough idea of what all the money was being spent on is very difficult. And that's just in addition to trying to keep track of all the other stuff going on in the world I'm trying to follow. So the infrastructure bill is the latest big spending bill that the United States has passed. And it's not really a COVID bill per se. I think technically part of the justification was to help goose the US economy, to help with the recovery from COVID, but that logic is a little weak at this point, given how strong the economic recovery has been. Labor shortages, wage increases, GDP up, unemployment down. I mean, metrics are pretty good, so it's debatable whether or not the economy really needs this, but that's never stopped the government before. We saw something similar with the Trump administration's big tax cut program, where they cut the headline corporate income tax rate. The U.S. economy was doing pretty good at the time, so the idea that the U.S. economy really needed that was pretty highly dubious. So similar logic now. It's more for political reasons, really, more than for economic reasons. Let's see, I gotta find the damn thing first. Where did I do with it? Here we go. Okay. So to talk a little bit about the politics of this is something that the Biden administration has wanted to do from the start. And really, a big infrastructure spending package has been a priority for administrations going back 30, 40 years. Everybody has wanted to do something like this. But, for partly due to partisan politics, legislative gridlock, and, other reasons, it's never really happened until now. So this is a big deal because this is the kind of infrastructure spending that people have been working towards for decades but had never really quite been able to pull off. So a significant development there. But one of the problems that the Democratic Party in the United States had with getting the bill passed is that there was a lot of disagreement about what should be in the bill. So there's a corresponding bill that's come to be called the Build Back Better plan. And that has a whole goodie bag of stuff that's very popular with the political left of the United States. Stuff like, what was it? Lower drug prices, family leave, stuff like that, basically. I don't remember the whole list of stuff was in it. That's a whole other list of notes that I have in here. So there was disagreement about whether there should just be one bill that has all of that stuff or whether they should separate the bills or just how all that would work. So what they ended up doing is that they separated the infrastructure stuff into one bill, and they tried to make that a bipartisan bill that had Republican support. And then they put all the more partisan stuff that wasn't going to get any Republican support in the Build Back Better plan. And they're going to try to pass that by way of reconciliation, which is this sort of technical, obscure procedural move that they can do that allows you to kind of get away with passing legislation with fewer votes than you would normally need. I'm not going to get all into that right now, but basically the infrastructure bill is the part of the bill that had bipartisan, is the part of the spending package that they wanted to pass that had bipartisan support. Now, once they achieved bipartisan support from the bill, the new problem they faced is the order of passage. Basically, they had to decide whether they were going to pass the Build Back Better plan first or whether they would pass the infrastructure bill first. And that turned into a big months-long political battle between the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the moderate wing. The moderate wing wanted to pass infrastructure first and then do Build Back Better later. And the progressive wing wanted to do Build Back Better first and the infrastructure bill later. And the reason that the progressive wing of the party really wanted to do Build Back Better first is because they were afraid that moderates in the party, once they had progressive votes for the infrastructure package, would then renege on promises to vote for the Build Back Better plan. Because there's been criticisms from the moderate wing of the party that the plan is too expensive, that they don't want to run up the debt too much, blah, 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 that basically kind of logic. So the progressive wing was paranoid about that and pushed really, really hard to try to get their bill, the Build Back Better plan, Build Back Better plan, passed first, so that they wouldn't have to worry about moderate support. Now, moderates in turn were not really keen on that. They wanted to just do the infrastructure bill first, and then that would give them leverage to kind of put pressure on the progressives to lower the overall headline cost of the Build Back Better plan, which again is exactly what the progressives were worried about. So basically, they just went back and forth on that over the past couple months. There was never any real, well, basically it was a deadlock. There wasn't any real progress on it up until the past week. And so the deal that was passed this past week, let's see here. So the infrastructure deal is going to get passed first, which is why we're talking about it. And what's going to happen is that 1 month from now, there's going to be a vote on the Build Back Better plan. And 1 month was decided upon because that'll give time for the release of a congressional budget report on the cost of the Build Back Better plan. So presumably, the moderates are going to not vote for the plan if the CBO reports that the cost is going to be really high, or at least try to leverage that into progressive concessions on the size of the bill. Alternatively, if the CBO decides that the bill is not that expensive, presumably moderates would be more willing to vote for it, and maybe then they can pass it by reconciliation like they were planning to. That's roughly my impression of the calculus going on here. So basically, progressives had to give way, and the only concession that they could get is a guaranteed vote, or at least a promised vote 1 month from now. And the reason that they had to kind of give way on this is because they ultimately didn't have the leverage. The moderates were a lot more committed to keeping costs down than the progressives were to ensuring a large bill that kind of had all of the stuff that their constituents wanted. You know, it's relatively easy for moderates to get away with averring on a major bill like this out of concern for cost. The political cost for progressive politicians, in contrast, for not getting anything done for lack of moderate support, would have been higher. And so that gave leverage to the moderates, and that's manifested as this deal, which has now resulted in the passage of the infrastructure bill. Let's see. Now, there was this deal that was reached, but some of the more progressive members of the Progressive Caucus in the Senate still were not on board with it. Actually, it wasn't the Senate, was it? It was actually the House. Some of the more progressive members in the House were still opposed to it, specifically some of the members of what's come to be called the Squad. I don't have the list of names here, but I think people are pretty familiar with them. People like AOC, Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, you know, so these kinds of politicians. They didn't like the deal, you know, obviously, no shock. And so they announced that they were not going to vote for it. And so that kind of put the House in a bind because the Democrats did not have enough votes without those progressive members to pass the deal without Republican support. And that was a problem because even though it was a bipartisan bill that had been negotiated in order to get Republican support, the minority chair in the House, House Rep McCarthy, had said that he did not want GOP members to vote for the bill if it provided the margin needed to pass. So the idea was that if Democrats had enough votes to pass it by themselves, then the GOP would vote for it, as per the bipartisan deal that was negotiated. But if the Democrats could not whip their members into broad-based support sufficient to pass it by themselves, the GOP in the House was not going to vote for it. So it came down to the Democratic Party in the House negotiating with dissident House Republican members to try to get them to defy that order and vote for the deal anyway. And that's what ended up happening. There was a gaggle of Republicans, mostly from the Northeast and some from the Midwest, that ended up defecting and voting for the bill. And that was enough to get it passed. So that's a brief description of the political drama that went into it. Again, it's mostly, it's not, well, I don't want to say mostly, but it's a bipartisan project for the most part in order to deal with infrastructure problems in the United States and help develop the economy. That sounds weird because the U.S. is already a developed economy, but there are problem areas in the United States that are not as developed as others, so the bill is meant to kind of alleviate that, and we'll get into some of the details of that a little bit later. Let's see. So to get into how it's being paid for, these are the offsets. Basically, this is how they're going to raise the revenue necessary to pay for all of this stuff that we're going to talk about. So $210 billion are going to come from unspent COVID-19 relief aid. So, the government, when it wants to pass a big spending bill, it'll procure funds and then it'll just have them at the ready to spend. But sometimes those programs don't blow through all of the funds that are set aside for them. And so that was the case for a lot of COVID-related programs. And so what they're going to do is they're going to appropriate those funds and use them for the infrastructure bill. So again, that's a pretty big chunk of it, $210 billion. There's also $53 billion in unemployment insurance aid that a number of states have since halted. So the leftover money from those programs also is going to be utilized. There's also a bunch of little stuff. Whenever the government is trying to scrounge up money to pay for something, there's always like a whole bevy of minor tax increases and fees and whatnot that they generate in order to try to generate revenue at the margin. So in this case, they're going to sell some petroleum from petroleum reserves. That's not going to generate a whole lot of money, but it's something. And then there's also going to be money generated from spectrum auctions for 5G services, which is money that they were going to get anyway. But basically, they've designated that money for the purpose of funding this infrastructure bill. Let's see, they've also got, Superfund excise taxes, which is a fun name. They're going to get about $14 billion out of this. And basically, this is an excise tax that's paid for by chemical firms, critical mineral firms, and metallic elements firms, basically mining companies. What happened is that back in 1980, I want to say, the EPA, a bill was passed that gave the EPA the power to regulate and clean up sites that had been basically environmentally obliterated from industrial activity. And these were called Superfund sites. And in order to help pay for the cleanup, the EPA was allowed to implement an excise tax on the firms responsible for the environmental damage in order to help pay for the cleanup effort. Now, eventually, that excise tax lapsed in 1995 and has not been in place since then. It was originally allowed to lapse because it was expected that new forms of revenue would be procured to help pay for cleanup, but they never actually did. So go figure. But anyway, this excise tax has now been re-implemented as part of the infrastructure bill in order to help pay for some of the costs. So again, that's $14 billion excise taxes on mostly heavy industry firms of one sort or another, specifically to help fund Superfund site cleanup. There's also some more ambiguous stuff. They said that they're going to strengthen tax enforcement as per relevant to cryptocurrencies. I'm not sure how they're going to do that. Kind of the whole point of cryptocurrencies is that you're trying to get around the government, so that's going to be a little difficult, but I guess they'll get some money out of it anyway. There's also some other ambiguously defined bipartisan measures. Those weren't really detailed in the articles I read, so that's something I need to read more about. And then, of course, there's every cost-benefit analyst's favorite trick in the book, which is to refer to future tax revenue generated by economic growth created by the bill in question.
It sounds a little bit circular.
It is. It is. So,
what's going to pay for the infrastructure bill? Well, the benefits of the infrastructure bill. Oh, that's great. Why didn't we do that before?
It's exactly as goofy as it sounds. Now, to be fair, from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, this is totally legit. Invariably, the infrastructure bill is going to have an economic impact over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, and invariably, that's going to have an impact on tax revenue. So it's not unreasonable from an analytical perspective to assume that this is going to happen and to try to quantify it to some degree. What happens in practice is that politicians will influence the process by nudging the expected economic benefit over time so that they can artificially boost the expected tax revenue. And what that allows you to do is more easily cover the costs of the bill in question. This is the same process happened with the Trump administration's big tax cut. One of the significant ways that they quote unquote paid for it is to assume that it would generate tax revenue in the future by generating economic activity. Now, again, it's a legitimate process. You can't knock it entirely, but the area where it gets fudged is sort of the questionable area. You know, the political influence there kind of distorts the cost-benefit analysis. And for those who don't know, they kind of have to do this because when you pass a bill in the Senate, well, not the Senate, but when Congress passes a bill, they're legally obligated to cover it. That is to say, to cover the cost of the bill. They can't just borrow money for everything, so to speak. You know, they do have to generate new taxes to cover most of it. I think they can increase the debt limit in order to allow some increase in costs. But I think there's like a whole process they have to go through that's a little more laborious. But anyway, for the most part, they're legally required to come up with tax revenues to offset the costs of new bills. And so one of the easiest ways to offset those costs is to just to refer to tax revenue from future economic activity caused by the bill. Let's see, so I think, yeah, that's all of the offsets I had here listed. So roughly, this is how they're going to pay for all of this stuff. So what's actually in the bill? So what's the actual meat of what they're doing here? So first off, the total cost of the bill is $1 trillion. This is $1 trillion in infrastructure spending. But only $550 billion of that is actually new spending. So what does that mean? So basically, every year, the federal government of the United States distributes funds to the states to help them pay for the maintenance of infrastructure like roads or rail or what have you, as well as help pay for an assortment of other infrastructure-related programs. And the amount spent on that from year to year doesn't really change all that much, you know, depending on what the Congress is adding or subtracting from that. It's actually a pretty consistent spending program from year to year. So the infrastructure bill, as it's being, you know, as it exists right now, is about half of spending that was going to happen regardless of the deal. It's all just maintenance and other stuff like that that was required spending, more or less. So the added on spending, this new spending that was not already going to be paid for as part of pre-existing on-running programs, amounts to about $550 billion. So when we talk about the infrastructure bill, keep in mind that the $1 trillion is the total amount, but that's more of a politically sensitive headline amount that the media kind of pushes out to get people excited for one reason or another. You know, either because it's really high or too high, depending on one's perspective. So let's see. So the $550 billion in new spending is what I'm going to talk about here. And for the curious, the expected impact on the national debt is that it's going to add about $256 billion, which is actually not all that much when you compare to all the other spending that's been going on the past couple of years. But yeah, there will be some hit there. Oh, also the form of the spending. So basically what I was reading today is that about 20% roughly of the total $550 billion that I'm going to be talking about here today is going to be spent in the form of discretionary program funds. So that's different than block grants, which is normally how funds like this are distributed.
What's a block grant?
The way block grants work is that they distribute them more or less equally to the states based off of a formula that's agreed beforehand. Mm-hmm. And then they also sometimes tie criteria that states have to meet in order to qualify for the funds. But for the most part, states themselves basically get that money to spend how they like. So block grants are preferred there, and, you know, poli-sci people, you know, keep me honest on this. But block grants are going to be how most of the spending is distributed, but 20% of it is going to be discretionary program funds, in which the government is going to have, that is to say, the federal government is going to have a lot more discretion in who gets the funds and who qualifies and which plans are allowed to get grants. And that's mostly going to come down to Pete Buttigieg, whom is the Secretary of Transportation right now. His office is going to be largely responsible for this 20% I'm talking about. Congress also will have significant oversight. You know, they're going to be able to determine what qualifications in order to qualify for this, that, or the other fund. And then the Department of Transportation also will be allowed to interpret the rules and qualifications that Congress sets out with a pretty wide latitude. He's going to have a lot of discretion in determining uh, what kinds of applicants and what kinds of projects are going to be relevant and have access to these grants. So basically, that's a long-winded way of saying that the federal government is going to have a lot of control over about 20% of the total spending. And those projects will probably go to projects that are relevant to the political preferences of the Biden administration and Democrats in general. And the rest of it, again, about 80% of it is going to be distributed according to the traditional block grant model, and that money is going to get used however states like. So more likely, conservative states are not going to be spending it in ways that Democrats in general are going to like. But because of the way the funds are distributed, they will have the freedom of action to spend it how they like. Let's see. And for the curious, the traditional formula for distributing funds according to the traditional model is based on state population, gas tax revenue, and quote-unquote other factors. So that's basically meant to ensure that the larger states who have greater needs get more resources. Smaller states that don't have as great a set of needs don't get as many resources in general.
So you're saying California is going to get more money than Rhode Island?
Yes. Unequivocally. So let's see, specific programs in the bill. So there's going to be about $110 billion for roads and bridges. And, again, some of that probably would have been spent anyway, but I'm talking specifically about the $550 billion that's new spending. So of that, $110 billion is going to go towards roads and bridges. And that's all just maintenance. Well, some of it is maintenance. Some of it is construction of new infrastructure. What have you. This isn't the sexiest one, but it is the one that everybody talks about when they talk about infrastructure. The people in the United States talk about crumbling infrastructure and how we need to spend more money on bridges and roads and whatnot. So this is the $110 billion designated for those complaints. So let's see, $73 billion is going to be designed to upgrade the electric grid. And so this is just meant to, in general, quote unquote, improve the reliability and resiliency of the power grid, end quote. In practice, from what I've read, it's going to come down more to greening the electric grid, as well as to expanding it. So allegedly, there's going to be thousands of miles of new resilient, quote unquote, transmission lines in order to facilitate the expansion of renewable energy. I don't know how much renewable energy is actually going to be, used here, but the idea is to just expand the number and length of existing transmission lines. So they're going to do that. They're going to create what's called a grid deployment authority. That's going to be a new agency that's going to be responsible for financing and encouraging the development of high voltage transmission lines. So says the White House. And it's going to be housed within the Energy Department. And the idea here is that it's kind of laborious from a red tape perspective, from a bureaucratic perspective, in order to build power lines across multiple state lines. Because if you're a power company and you want to do that, you have to get approval from all of the regulatory agencies of all the relevant state governments that you're building the lines through. And again, that's just expensive, it takes a long time, it's laborious, it's a problem. So if you want to expand the capacity of the electrical grid in the United States, one of the things you can do is try to make that process easier. And so that's what this new agency is specifically supposed to address. It's supposed to distribute financing and otherwise coordinate between state-level agencies in order to make this process easier for electrical utilities. Okay, so the other electric bill stuff, they're going to invest in research and development for advanced transmission and electricity distribution technologies. Basically just R&D and better, more greener electrical tech. And then they're going to try to promote smart grid technologies that are supposed to deliver flexibility and resilience. Again, more buzzwords. But basically, there's some existing smart grid technology that they could implement but haven't had the money to do. So they're just going to try to expedite the rollout of those technologies in order to make the electrical grid more efficient. And let's see here, they also wanted to, the last point here is they wanted to invest in demonstration projects and research hubs for next generation tech. And the specific technologies referenced here are advanced nuclear technology, carbon capture, and clean hydrogen. So you can look forward to some of that stuff getting some publicly supported grant money in the future, such that you might actually see it work. The R&D stuff is stuff in new technologies. This specific demonstration project stuff is going to invest in cutting edge technologies and try to kind of get them out the door, so to speak. So let's see. So that's, again, $73 billion for upgrading the electrical grid in these disparate ways. Let's see. So for rail, they've got $66 billion allocated. A lot of that is just going to try to eliminate the backlog of maintenance for Amtrak, which is apparently pretty considerable. They're going to do $24 billion of that to federal-state partnership grants in order to improve the Northeastern Corridor. Actually, I should probably explain what Amtrak is, since not everybody listening is from the United States. Amtrak is like a public-private partnership. Actually, it's probably mostly public at this point. It's basically a publicly run train, a rail line. And what's unique about it is that it's a passenger rail line, which is virtually extinct in the United States otherwise. A lot of passenger lines disappeared in the 50s and 60s, but there was some demand to continue to have some passenger rail capacity. So the federal government jumped in and provided spending to some public-private partnerships, and eventually I think it just became government-owned and run. So passenger lines in the northeastern United States are pretty much the only ones that are economically viable at this point.
There's Amtrak here. I actually went on an Amtrak train ride. 2 of them even.
Oh, yeah.
And I have some things to report. For one, the experience of being on the train and having a train ride, that's great. It's nice. Trains have more consistent like stop and start than like red light, green light if you're driving a car. It's safer per person than riding around in a car. The downside is they're basically second to any freight that's happening on the rail line. So if there's freight that needs to go through, the Amtrak has to wait for them. So I got a ride from Seattle to Salem, which started really early in the morning, and that has to be on time because it's the first one of the day. Really great, really pleasant train ride. The way back, it was delayed 4 hours. 4 hours of a delay for your transport. And I was like, what is going on with this? Like, that seems like a really substantial delay, and it keeps increasing. And they were like, oh, freight. So, yeah. It does have some downsides. I like train rides, though.
Yeah, it's an efficient mode of travel. The trouble is that most regions of the United States do not have the population density in order to make them economical. So a lot of them outside of the northeastern U.S. depend on subsidies from the federal or state government in order to cover all of their costs.
Mm.
So that's why most of the money is going towards the Northeastern Corridor, $24 billion. They're going to try to upgrade that and get that in a better condition, basically. But like you say, there are Amtrak lines outside of the Northeast, and they're going to get about $12 billion.
Mm-hmm.
There's about $12 billion in partnership grants for intercity rail services, including high-speed rail. And that's just about expanding capacity, modernizing them, refitting them, etc. And then they've also got $5 billion for rail improvement and safety grants, and then $3 billion for grade crossing safety improvements. So basically safety. There's also $22 billion here that I have not been able to account for yet. Because again, I haven't finished reading about all the details here. I'm giving you more of the summary of what's in the bill. So $66 billion for rail lines. I can account for about 2/3 of that, and then there's $22 billion I don't know what's for. I read that it's the largest federal investment in passenger rail services since Amtrak was founded 50 years ago, so a little trivia for you. I also found it interesting here that rail lines lack a multi-year funding stream in order to address deferred maintenance and enhancing existing corridors and whatnot. So like with highways, freeways, and whatnot, like I said before, they kind of have an annual spending that's just kind of baked in. Congress basically just votes, yes, we will continue to do that, and then the money gets distributed. but they don't have a similar mechanism for Amtrak and rail lines, apparently. So I didn't know that. Interesting trivia. Let's see, $65 billion for broadband. I was particularly interested to see how exactly they were going to do this, because this is going to be tricky, given that there's such large corporations involved and whatnot. Let's see. So the idea here is just to expand access in the United States to broadband and to improve the quality of broadband, the speed, basically, of broadband in the United States. One of the things they want to focus on doing is lowering prices. Again, that's just to make it more accessible. So they have 3 specific ways that I read that they're going to try to do that. They're going to require funding recipients to offer a low-cost affordable plan. That is to say that if you want to get money to expand infrastructure, you're going to have to make a low-cost plan, basically, in order to try to reach out for the lower end of the market, which they would probably not otherwise do. So that's a condition of the funding. They're going to require providers to display a quote-unquote broadband nutrition label, which is a weird term. That's going to be designed to help families compare deals with different providers. Basically, just make it a little easier to do cost comparison across providers. And then the third item here, they're going to try to boost competition in areas where existing providers are not providing adequate service. That's the most ambiguous one. I don't really know how exactly they're going to operationalize that.
They could set some floor of if the region is not providing this or higher service, but they have a monopoly and they won't share the lines with anyone, then they're going to try to help the competition. That's a big part of why a lot of American internet is just really bad, is they'll own the cables going to your place, so no other company can offer that speed, and it's expensive to build. Mm-hmm. So they can basically, it's not really holding people at knife point, but it's holding people at shitty internet for exorbitant rate point. And yep. They don't have an alternative.
Yeah, the lack of competition there is a problem. But part of the problem also is that the market is not, it's not a monopoly. It's not even an oligopoly, but it is what you would call monopolistic. There's a few large firms that predominate. And that makes it relatively easy for them to implicitly collude with each other to not enter markets that one or the other is present in. So even if you say, even if the federal government comes in and say, okay, this firm needs to share their lines or needs to allow more access, basically, to facilitate competition, that doesn't inherently mean that there will be market entrance into that market, just because of that implicit understanding some of the larger firms have. So I'm not sure how they're going to deal with that. I'm sure they've got some details written in that I'm not aware of, but I would just point out that that's particularly difficult to do. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Another objective here, beyond just lowering prices, they want to improve internet access in rural areas for low-income families and for tribal communities, specifically. Didn't have details on how to do that. I'm guessing they're going to have some kind of grant program where they allow, where they give money to telecoms firms to help them build out infrastructure into the relevant communities. But that's just a guess on my part. Let's see, some other stuff they want to do. They want to try to close the digital divide, quote unquote, by doing 3 things here: passing the Digital Equity Act, which creates grant programs for quote unquote digital inclusion. I don't know what that means. Again, I have to read more about it, but presumably the devil is in the details there. Requiring the FCC to adopt rules banning digital redlining. I didn't even know that was a thing. So I guess if there is prejudicial redlining going on, then certainly there should be action on that. But I hadn't been aware telecommunications firms were doing that. So I guess maybe they're either doing it and I didn't know about it, or they're just creating some new term here that they can use as an excuse to try to fund these programs. It kind of depends just on how you want to define, legally speaking, digital redlining. And then the third item here, creating a new permanent program to help more low-income households access the internet. That kind of folds into some of the other stuff here, so I'm not sure if that's just an extension of the other programs they're already going to do, or if that's going to turn into a separate program specifically designed to do that. Again, that's all pretty ambiguous. So let's see. That's all the items for the broadband spending. Again, that's $65 billion dedicated to that. Some of the notes I had here. Yeah, most of the money will be made through grants, no shock. Oh, it's going to build on some of the money that was distributed through the American Rescue Plan. The American Rescue Plan was the big COVID bill that was passed, I want to say immediately after, basically, Biden came into office. So that plan included not only a lot of COVID-specific stuff, but it also included a lot of money that was allocated towards improving access to broadband. So this bill is basically kind of an extension of that. It kind of builds on some of the programs that were built as a result of that legislation. Let's see. Got a few more here. Well, a lot more. $55 billion for water quality. This is the lead pipe thing. I think we might have talked about that before. So there's a lot of lead pipes in the United States, and they kind of, what's the word I want? They poison the water supply effectively. And that can cause a lot of problems for child development and as well as just general health and well-being. So there's going to be $15 billion here that's allocated to replace just lead pipes. And then they have $10 billion allocated to address water contamination from something called polyfluoroalkyl substances. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Basically, this compound was used in the development of Teflon. And it's also been used in firefighting foam, water-repellent clothing, and some other items. So apparently there's been some contamination from items like this, and they're allocating some money to clean it up. I don't have the rest of the money. I've only got $25 billion of the $55 billion confirmed at this point, so to speak. So I'll have to read more about it and figure out where the rest of that money. But Teflon material and lead pipes, thus far, is what I have for water quality. $50 billion for climate change measures. So basically, this is going to be funds to protect against droughts, floods, wildfires. They're also going to make a major investment in weatherization in order to make energy, what I assume at least to be mostly energy stuff, to be more resilient to weather-based phenomena. Not a lot of details on that either. $21 billion for environmental cleanup. This refers to cleaning up Superfund sites, which we talked about before, and also brownfield sites. And they're also going to spend money to reclaim abandoned mine land and to cap orphaned gas wells, which are gas wells that have been abandoned, but which are still emitting, basically, gas of one sort or another. So that's $21 billion to clean up. They're also doing $15 billion for electric vehicles. So this is going to be $7.5 billion for electrical vehicle charging stations, the idea being to create a network all around the country so that it's easier for people to just kind of drive electric vehicles anywhere and have access to charging stations such that they can refuel. You know, right now not everywhere has charging stations, so you're kind of limited in where you can go in an electrical vehicle. So they're going to try to build out that network with this $7.5 billion program. Let's see, there's also $5 billion for the purchase of electric school buses and hybrids. That's just meant to replace the existing bus fleet. And then $2.5 billion for what I think might be ferries. I'm not sure how that works, but I need to read more about that. But that was mentioned kind of in passing in an article I read. Let's see. So that's the $15 billion for electric vehicles. $39 billion for public transit. So this is going to be $8 billion for the expansion of transportation systems. Specifically, they're going to try to bring transit service to new communities with an additional $8 billion for capital investment grants. So this, I don't think, encompasses Amtrak. I think this is separate. So I'm guessing this is going to be stuff like local rail, maybe localized Amtrak. I don't know. But there is some overlap there, maybe. But also buses and other forms of mass transportation. $1.75 billion in dedicated funding for the improvement of accessibility for people with disabilities. So this is to make like train stations and whatnot handicap accessible, in so much as they aren't already.
Ramps and whatnot.
Yeah, I would assume so. But maybe some other stuff for other disabled groups as well. Uh, $5.75 billion to modernize bus and rail fleets. This is going to replace vehicles with clean zero-emission vehicles through an addition, yeah, et cetera, et cetera. So again, there's some overlap here with some of the other stuff on electric vehicles, but I'm not sure just how much the funding overlaps. Like, is it the same money being talked about in different programs, or are these different programs entirely? I don't know yet. They're also going to spend some to repair and upgrade aging mass transportation infrastructure. Oh, something I meant. Right. So I should have mentioned this before. So the spending bill, all of this money that's been allocated for all of these programs is for the next 5 years. So this is not in perpetuity. It's not like they're going to create these programs and then they're going to last forever. Technically, they're going to time out in 5 years' time. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, it's not $550 billion per year that they're going to spend on this. This is $550 billion that's going to be spent over the course of the next 5 years. So it's more like $110 billion per year in infrastructure spending for the next 5 years. Okay, so that's it. We talked about public transit. They've also got $42 billion for port and airport infrastructure. It's exactly what you think it is. $25 billion for airports to improve things like runways, gates, taxiways, terminals, and air traffic control towers. And then $17 billion for equivalent such port infrastructure. So they want to basically just alleviate repair and maintenance backlogs, reduce congestion and emissions near ports and airports, and then they want to also use this as an excuse to propagate electrification and other, propagate electrification and then also propagate low carbon technologies. So that's all pretty intuitive. And then there's also $11 billion in transportation safety programs. $5 billion of that is Safe Streets for All program, which apparently is just a program that helps localities reduce crashes and fatalities. And then also grants to community-owned utilities to replace leaking and obsolete cast iron and bare steel natural gas pipelines. Some of which are apparently over 100 years old, which I thought was interesting trivia. So some of this stuff here is just pretty intuitive. Old infrastructure being replaced. And then local safety programs, also pretty intuitive stuff. There's also $1 billion in order to help. This is kind of weird. This has to do with the fact that a lot of freeways that were built in the 1950s and 60s were built through minority communities. That was, well, I don't know if it was seen at the time as prejudicial, but it's certainly seen in hindsight as prejudicial because the communities impacted were disproportionately minority communities. So they're going to allocate $1 billion here in order to help with the funding, to help fund the planning, designing, demolition, and reconstruction of street grids, parks, and other infrastructure. And again, this is specifically to try to undo some of the damage done to those communities. I'm not entirely sure how effective that's going to be, because I would imagine those communities have kind of evolved since then around the changes. But I guess some of them could rejuvenate. I don't know. It seems like kind of a weird thing to do. But maybe there's more to it than I know right now, so I'll try to read more about that as well. But yeah, that's it. That's all I had. So that accounts for all of the stuff I just talked about, adds up to about $547 billion. So that still leaves a couple $1 billion that I haven't been able to account for yet, in addition to the stuff within the different subcomponents of the bill that I couldn't account for. So as the name implies, it's all infrastructure to one degree or another. Big chunks of it have to do with the environment or social justice in varying degrees, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of meat to the bill. Oh, I would point out as meta commentary here, one of the trends amongst developed countries over the past couple years has been a trend towards green industrial policy. Industrial policy hasn't really been a big deal in the West for a long time because of, neoliberalism and the shift towards free trade and small governments and whatnot. But it's making something of a comeback in the guise of environmentalism. So, technically, we can argue that we can maintain the existing free trade regime while at the same time allowing for greater subsidies in order to allow states to address the climate emergency, in order to address climate change and environmental concerns. So a lot of states are taking the opportunity to kind of have their cake and eat it too, maintaining the free trade regime while at the same time implementing industrial policies that would otherwise be illegal, or at least not allowed under a free trade regime. And so that has resulted in stuff like this infrastructure bill, where a lot of money is being spent on things like electric cars, building electric networks, stuff that's going to benefit private industry and will help American private industry. That's, well, in so much as it's related to the Green Revolution. And so this is the American manifestation of that trend, basically. There are European equivalents, but this is the American one.
Yeah, that sounds like a way to get both the left and the right fired up about something. Is if you have it be environmentally friendly, the left says, yay. And if you have it be privately owned, the right says, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, automotive companies that are developing electric cars will benefit from this. Private sector companies will benefit from the general improvement in infrastructure. So, there are definitely advantages to this. And certainly Republicans have wanted to do an infrastructure bill too. They just kind of wanted to do it in their own way. That's why the Trump administration was never able to quite get it done. But now everybody's kind of gotten something of what they wanted. So there should be general benefits that are broad-based for once.
Yeah, I can see how this effort would be one that gets some traction. The way that roads look has a pretty big impression on the quality of life in a given location. Like, obviously there are tons of different factors, but that's one of the ones that's really visible. Is like, if the streets near where you live are really shitty, like, you don't feel good about that, and you feel like it needs to be fixed, and it kind of gnaws at your mind. Kind of like how if your living space is a mess, it leaves something to be desired. Like, that has to be taken care of, and it's a more visible problem than some of the, I guess, less visible ones you could articulate or make bills about.
Yeah, people pay attention to that. Potholes are a big deal when it comes to local politics. People will complain about that. Yeah, the visible stuff is definitely the stuff that really kind of mobilizes people. I don't know if you remember, but there was a major bridge across the Mississippi River in Minneapolis that collapsed a couple years ago. So that helped propel infrastructure as a significant political issue. It already had been, but whenever stuff like that happens, it kind of rejuvenates the political issue as present in the body politic and its discussions. Let's see. But yeah, that's all I would have on the infrastructure bill. That's something I'm going to try to read more about, just to kind of see how everything is operationalized in practice, so that I can get an idea of how impactful it's actually going to be. Some of the stuff I can all but guarantee you just isn't going to have a big impact. Some of the softer, more ambiguously defined stuff is probably just there for political reasons. So that stuff probably isn't going to do too much. But I'm sure there's going to be a lot of stuff that does have an impact. I just need to figure out which is which, basically. So that's going to be an ongoing project.
Well, it's a massive bill, and it's going to involve multiple states in deciding who gets what money. So there's a lot of potential things that could go wrong, and a lot of potential improvements that could help us out a lot.
Oh, yeah. And it's going to be even more complicated to get into the Build Back Better plan, because that's probably, I suspect, going to be passed, by way of reconciliation, but it will be passed. And that's right now something like $1.75 trillion in total spending. And unlike the infrastructure bill, where only half of the headline total amount is, new spending, all of that 1.75 trillion in the BBB plan is new spending. So that's a lot to account for. That's going to be very complicated. But let's see. I suspect I blew through that 30 minutes, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So if we have time, could I just squeeze in an Ethiopia update?
Yeah.
Yeah, so last week I talked about Ethiopia in response to a question, and we talked about how there's probably going to be a prolonged standoff for at least a year because the government is going to play for time. You know, international sanctions, humanitarian sanctions specifically, are probably going to force their hand to reach some kind of peace deal, and they don't want to do that. They want to crush the rebellion. And then the TPLF, for its part, I said would probably just play for time and try to hold the territory that they already control, which principally is Tigray territory anyway. So subsequent developments that occurred the next day after we talked about that proved me wrong. Because apparently the TPLF is sufficiently strong that it has all but crushed the Ethiopian army and is slowly pushing towards the capital, which I did not think could happen, let alone would happen. So this is something that came out of events earlier this year. The TPLF had been basically defeated in the early part of the war, and the Ethiopian army had occupied pretty much all of Tigray province. But what happened is that the TPLF mobilized as a guerrilla force in the countryside, and they were able to kick the Ethiopian army out. And when that happened, the TPLF said that they had crushed the Ethiopian army. And I was pretty dubious about that because, you know, in wars like this, people make big claims. And I just kind of thought it was cheap talk. And the Ethiopian army definitely was defeated. You know, they definitely suffered a loss, but I figured that they would rally, mobilize new forces, and that they would come back at the Tigray, you know, launch another offensive into the Tigray province. And more or less, that's what the Ethiopian government had been signaling in the wake of the disaster. What current events are suggesting is that the TPLF actually was not exaggerating. It seems that they actually did gut the Ethiopian army when that happened. And right now, it seems that the Ethiopian army has just been reeling since then. So the TPLF has more or less been confirmed to have taken cities outside of Tigray province that are in Afar province, I think it was. And they're basically, if you look at where the cities they've taken are, you can see them getting closer to Addis Ababa, you know, the capital of Ethiopia. And at this point, it's an open question as to whether or not the Ethiopian army can actually stop them. There's also an open question as to whether or not the TPLF would really be able to seize the city, or if they did, do anything with it, because there's a lot of opposition to TPLF rule. So even if they did manage to take it, that might just expand the conflict into a civil war between the government and the TPLF, into a civil war between the TPLF and every other major faction in Ethiopia. Now, I think the TPLF kind of knows that, so they've made some effort to reach out to other rebel groups that are basically ethno-nationalist groups in other provinces. And they've reached some kind of agreement with like 8 of them, I think. But some of these groups are basically little more than terrorist groups, so I don't know how much pull they actually have in their own provinces. So I don't know that this alliance, as it's called, is really going to amount to much.
I pulled up the map. Which part of Ethiopia is Tigray province?
Northwest.
Northwest.
Yeah, you might be able to zoom in a little bit and see a rough outline, because I don't think they show provincial borders if you zoom out at the national level.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Tigray is roughly in the northwest of the country. But yeah, as of right now, the Ethiopian government and its forces are in, it seems, pretty dire straits, to the point where the Ethiopian government was releasing statements requesting people in the capital to mobilize into militia units to defend the city. So events are developing pretty rapidly.
Yeah, and a bit of an upset in terms of who you thought would win.
Yeah, definitely.
There are a lot of silly claims, too, that people will make, especially when they're on this kind of war path and they fancy themselves revolutionaries and all this. We saw this with like ISIS and whatnot, of like, we're going to take over the world. Blah! And it's like, yeah, you're very excited and you took some territory, but it's whatever. And a lot of it is overblown, but yeah, damn, they're actually making some pushes.
Yeah. And part of that is the Ethiopian army's lack of preparedness. Part of it is a difference in, motivation. The Ethiopian army, unfortunately, committed a number of atrocities when they moved into Tigray province initially to crush the TPLF. And so that shifted the tone of the conflict from one which was principally between political elites largely a rivalry between the leader of the TPLF and the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Mr. Abiy. So that was the initial tone of the conflict, but after the invasion, it became more about ethnic rivalry. It became more about a desire of the Tigray people to escape from the oppression of the Ethiopian army and government. And unfortunately, that's lent a lot more power to the TPLF, and obviously, as we've seen, they're the more effective fighting force. Another factor is that the leader of the TPLF is a, I don't want to say world renowned, but he's a well-respected guerrilla fighter who kind of cut his teeth fighting against the communist government in the 1980s. So he has a lot of experience operating as a guerrilla fighter. And it's not entirely clear if the Ethiopian army has leadership that is equally qualified. It would seem not. There's also the problem that Ethiopia has had a lot of problems with ethno-nationalist violence in a variety of provinces around the country. And so that's tying down some forces as well that have not been freed up to fight with the TPLF.
Yeah,
One of the reasons. Go ahead.
That's a tricky thing if you're a government and you're trying to defend your borders and establish the monopoly on violence, is if you're overly aggressive and violent with how you kind of smack down, then you end up being seen as the bad guy, and that emboldens the opposition and more people are going to join that side.
All right, what was that?
If you're the government and say there's a faction that's revolting and what have you, and you roll into the area and you say, in this instance, commit atrocities, then that's going to embolden that group and also get more people to join the group because you become the bad guy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was quite the political boon for the TPLF, it seems, and they've been able to make considerable hay out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going strong. We'll see if they do anything. I've read one analysis that suggested they just wanted to scare the Ethiopian government into giving concessions. Because again, the likelihood that the TPLF takes the capital and just basically becomes the new government seems unlikely. But it's also possible that maybe taking the capital would result in the government kicking Abiy out, basically forcing him to resign. And then whatever new leadership comes to power after that reaches some kind of accord with the TPLF. So they may have reason to take the capital if that's possible. But whether or not that's possible comes down to how strong Abiy's hold over the government is. And that's not entirely clear at this point. So we'll see. High drama in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
As a side note here, I thought it was pretty hilarious when the Ethiopian government issued its request for citizens in Addis Ababa to mobilize into militias to defend the capital from the TPLF. Facebook actually censored that because it said they violated community guidelines. Apparently, that was interpreted as a call to violence against ethnic Tigray people, and there has been some of that happening around the country. But it seems kind of stupid to me that, you're a government fighting for your life against a powerful rebel group, and you're apparently not allowed to ask your people to mobilize to help you fight them. It seemed pretty goofy to me.
Yeah, you can't use our platform for a call to action in war, I guess is the stance. A lot of stuff ends up being automated, I think, and then you have to petition with the actual people who can pull the levers on the site after that. But yeah, it probably detects keywords and stuff, and maybe they just don't want to get involved. Facebook is already in some kind of murky water in terms of the public perception.
Well, the thing is, they're already involved because a lot of the ethno-nationalists in Ethiopia actually use Facebook in order to organize. And Facebook hasn't been very proactive, again, in dealing with them, which is one of the major criticisms of Facebook, actually. Ethiopia specifically comes up a fair amount in those criticisms. But now that the government is, again, fighting against well, maybe not an ethno-nationalist group, but certainly an ethnic militia in all but name, it seems they're not allowed to deal with that, which seems weird to me. I guess to be fair to Facebook, like you say, it's an ambiguous situation and it's hard to make judgment calls. You're invariably going to piss off one group or the other. But, for a government in that situation to be censored like that just seemed hilarious to me. It would be like if they censored the Union in the American Civil War for calling for state militias to come and fight with the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's weird.
Yeah. We live in new and strange times.
What do we do with that?
Well, cool. Did you want to touch flags at all before we wrap?
Let's see. I did want to ask the Chileans again if there were any updates on the Constitution, because I know that's still going on.
You say Chileans. There was someone who showed up right before we started, and they were like, hey, there's another Chilean in chat. Thanks, Chileans, for hanging out. How's the Constitution?
Oh, wow, we have somebody in Vietnam. Hello to Mr. Vietnam. Thank you for listening to us. I guess if I had a question for anybody from Vietnam, it's what's going on with the leadership transition? Because I think they've got some new people coming in to lead the government. I was just reading a little bit about that the other day. Let's see, there's Ukraine, Russia. What is that? Romania, Malaysia. Yeah, pretty much the usual suspects.
Well, cool. If you have any questions about what we talked about or corrections, we welcome that in the YouTube comments. We're not experts in all this kind of stuff. We're just trying to figure out what's going on. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate your time, as always, Mr. Agent Smith.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Always a privilege.
And thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for handling questions, and chat for being awesome. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Thanks again. See you next time.
Smith. Smith.